The night had started off like any other, routine and quiet. I was a lieutenant in charge of security at a National Guard airfield, a post that, for the most part, didn't see much action. The job was pretty simple, and it was about as mundane as it could get. I'd spend most of my shifts walking the same hallways, checking the same doors, making sure the place was secure. That night, however, was different. The night that changed everything. I started my patrol around 2 a.m., a time that was dead quiet. The airfield had long been empty, except for a few hangars and storage buildings that held equipment, and of course, the main drill hall and office area where I spent most of my time. It wasn't a large building, but it had enough rooms and hallways to keep me busy. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, just another night's shift, another round of checks, another few hours of boredom. I started in the main hallway of the office area. The building had been locked down for the night, with no one inside except me. I'd already gone through the drill hall, checking the small offices off to the side. Every room was secure. Every door was locked from the outside. I was the only person in the building. I walked slowly, methodically, making sure to check every corner, every window. The hallways were always dark at this time of night, lit only by the yellowish glow of the dim overhead lights. The silence felt oppressive, the kind of silence that can weigh down on you after a while. I reached the front door after a thorough check of the building. I stepped outside into the cool night air, taking a moment to breathe in the calm. The stillness of the airfield was almost eerie, with not a single sound breaking the silence. My boots clicked softly on the pavement as I walked down the front steps and toward my vehicle. It was then, just as I was about to reach the gate, that I heard it. The sound of footsteps, loud, fast, like someone sprinting down the hallway behind me. I froze. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was inside the building, and they were running down the hallway toward the right. There was no one supposed to be there. I was the only one in the building. My heart raced as I turned and sprinted back toward the entrance. My weapon was drawn, my mind racing, trying to think through the situation. Who could it be? What the hell was going on? I reached the front door, pushed it open, and stepped inside, shouting down the hall, "Stop! Who's there?" The sound of footsteps grew louder, but I didn't hear anyone responding. No voice, no answer, just the pounding of running feet. I charged down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty building. I made it to the end of the hallway where the double doors led out to the motor pool. They were locked, just as I'd left them. There was no way anyone could have slipped through without me seeing. I checked the locks, still secure. The doors weren't even rattling. No one was there. I turned around, heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I walked back down the hallway, weapon still drawn, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. I called out again, "Who's in here?" My voice echoed off the walls. I made my way back to the front door, trying to make sense of the situation. I rechecked every office as I passed by. The doors were locked from the outside, just like I had left them. Every office was empty. No one was there. I couldn't explain it. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. The whole building was secured. I walked back through the entire building, clearing each room again, more carefully this time. Nothing. No one. Then, as I walked in the main drill hall, something caught my eye. A fan. A large, freestanding fan that had been off the last time I checked. Now it was running, spinning slowly, casting a gentle breeze around the room. I stopped in my tracks. That fan hadn't been on earlier. I knew it hadn't been. I had checked everything. The place had been still, eerily still. There was no way I had missed it. I walked up to the fan, slowly, my eyes never leaving it, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind was racing. Was I losing it? Was I just tired? Could I have missed something during my earlier checks? Then I called out, "Is anyone here?" The moment the words left my mouth, the fan stopped. Not slowed down, not gradually spun to a halt. It just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. The sound of the fan's motor was gone, leaving only the heavy silence behind. The room felt different now, colder. The temperature had dropped in an instant, the air turning sharp and biting. It was like someone had turned the thermostat down to freezing without warning. I felt a chill run up my spine, the kind of chill that isn't just from the cold air. This was something else. something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air felt dense, almost suffocating. I glanced around the room, my mind frantically trying to piece things together. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was just a malfunction, just the fan's motor messing up, but it didn't feel that way. The cold was too intense. It felt unnatural, like the air had shifted in a way I couldn't explain. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, I knew I had to leave. My instincts kicked in, telling me to get out, to leave the building. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to be a part of it. I turned and bolted out of the drill hall, my feet pounding on the floor as I ran for the front door. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My mind was in overdrive, trying to rationalize what had just happened, but it didn't make sense. It still didn't make sense. I made it back to my car, breathing heavily, my hands shaking as I grabbed the door handle. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. But even as I sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I had never felt that cold, never heard that fan stop like that. It was too precise, too deliberate. But who or what could have done it? I didn't know, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. Back at the airfield, I immediately went to the security office. I needed to look at the security cameras. Maybe there was something on the footage that could explain what happened. I pulled up the playback from the cameras in the building. I watched myself walk through the halls, checking the rooms, checking the doors, doing exactly what I was supposed to do. But then came the moment I had heard those footsteps. Nothing. There was nothing on the footage. No figures running down the hallway. No sounds of footsteps. The fan was still off, as it should have been. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was as if it hadn't even happened. I stared at the screen, my brain struggling to process it. It was all just me, acting like a crazy security guard on meth, according to the footage. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. The cold, the fan, the footsteps. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't justify it. I quit 2 weeks later. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened in that building that I couldn't explain. Something I wasn't meant to understand. I didn't care what the cameras said or what anyone else thought. That cold, that feeling of being watched, it had been real, and it had been enough to drive me out. I never went back to that airfield. And to this day, I don't know what happened that night. But I do know this. There was something in that building, something that wasn't right. And I wasn't about to stick around long enough to figure it out. I was 9 years old, living in one of the Army estates, what they called married quarters. These estates were home to military families, spread out all over the place, each of them with their own set of narrow, tidy streets, short rows of identical houses, and little patches of green with playgrounds scattered between them. It was the sort of place where the kids had no real concept of danger. We ran around all day, cycling between the swings, climbing on jungle gyms, and making up games, and we all knew one another by sight, if not by name. One afternoon, my best friend and I were at one of the playgrounds, just like any other day. We were sitting on the swings, our legs kicking back and forth in that rhythmic motion that felt comforting and free. It was the 80s, so naturally our conversation revolved around Madonna, ponies, and what we might want for our birthdays. It was simple. It was innocent. We had no concept of the world outside, our little bubble. It was a quiet afternoon. The air had that soft, summer warmth, and the sun was starting to lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The estate was mostly quiet, with only the occasional car driving past or another kid's voice calling out in the distance. Then we noticed him, a guy, maybe around 25, walking toward the swings where we were sitting. At first, I didn't think much of it. People came and went in the park all the time, mostly parents or older siblings keeping an eye on younger kids, but something about him stood out. He didn't look like a parent, and he didn't seem to be in a hurry. He walked over with a slow, almost purposeful pace, and I noticed the way his eyes lingered on us as he approached. My friend, being much braver than me, didn't hesitate. She waved and smiled, thinking he might be a relative or friend of someone we knew. The man smiled back, but his smile was strange. It wasn't the kind of smile that was warm or friendly. It was almost like he was trying too hard, like he was pretending to be happy or normal. He was dressed in a plain t-shirt and jeans, and his hair was cut short, Nothing about him screamed danger, but even as a child, something about his presence just felt off. He stopped near the swings and said something to us. My friend, still thinking he was someone she recognized, asked his name, but he didn't answer. Instead, he started asking us questions, things like how old we were, what we liked to do, and did we like animals? At first, I thought it was just normal small talk. After all, adults sometimes made conversation with kids, right? But the more he spoke, the more uncomfortable I started to feel. He wasn't asking normal questions, not like the ones parents or teachers would ask. He kept changing the subject, asking us strange, probing things like if we liked horses or if we had any pets, but not in a way that seemed curious, more like he was trying to keep us talking. It was a little unnerving, but I wasn't sure why. Then, he did something that made my stomach flip. He stepped closer and began pushing me on the swing. I remember the way my body moved with each push, faster and faster. At first it felt okay, but then something in my gut told me it wasn't right. I was uncomfortable with how close he was standing. He wasn't just pushing the swing. His hands were brushing against my legs, lightly at first, then more intentionally, and I froze. It wasn't that I didn't know how to handle it. I was a smart kid, but I wasn't prepared for someone to cross that line so directly. "Stop," I said, my voice louder than I intended. He didn't stop. He just kept pushing. I repeated it, but the man didn't react. His hand touched my leg again, and I felt the sick feeling rise in my stomach. Without thinking, I did the only thing that seemed to make sense. I swung my legs out as hard as I could, kicking him in the groin. The man stumbled back, and for a split second, I thought he might get angry or something, but instead, he grabbed my legs and jerked me off the swing entirely. I wasn't expecting it. My body jerked in midair, and before I could do anything, I crashed onto the ground. The pain was immediate, sharp, and dizzying. The back of my head hit the hard, uneven pavement, and I remember hearing the sickening thud as it bounced off the ground. For a moment, I couldn't even focus on the pain. Everything just felt foggy. Then I heard my friend scream, her voice high-pitched and frantic. I tried to sit up, but the world was spinning and my vision was blurry. I could hear the man running off, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. But my friend was already at my side, her hands shaking as she tried to help me stand. The only thing I could really focus on was the throb in my head, the overwhelming dizziness, and the fact that the man was already gone. We didn't waste time thinking. We ran as fast as we could back to my house, my friend's hand gripping mine tightly, as if she could somehow protect me from whatever had just happened. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning. We burst through the door, and I saw my mother sitting at the kitchen table, her face filled with concern when she saw us. "What happened?" she asked, already looking at the blood on my knees and the way I was holding my head, as if something terrible had happened. I tried to explain what had happened, how this man had come up to us, how he'd pushed me on the swing, and how I had kicked him away. My voice was shaky, and my mom's expression shifted from concern to alarm. She picked up the phone immediately and called the police. The police came by later, asking me the same questions over and over, trying to piece together what had happened. They were concerned, but not just for me. It turned out that there had been other reports of similar incidents in the area. Other kids had encountered strange men, and while they hadn't been hurt like I had, the police were starting to connect the dots. The man who'd come to the playground wasn't just some random adult. He was part of a pattern of disturbing behavior in our neighborhood. The next few days were a blur. My mom kept me close, not allowing me to go to the park or play outside without her or my dad. I wasn't allowed to walk anywhere alone. And every time we left the house, my mom was watching the street, eyes scanning the surroundings, making sure no one was lingering too close. She didn't want to scare me, but I could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't until a few days later that we found out that the police had managed to catch a man matching the description I gave. He was a local, just a few blocks away, living in one of the houses on the estate. The police didn't go into details, but they told us that they had enough evidence to charge him with several other incidents. He wasn't a stranger at all. He had been hanging around the area for weeks, talking to kids, and approaching them in the same strange way he'd approached me. I never saw him again, but I didn't need to. I knew that I'd been lucky. I knew that my instincts had saved me. I think about that day often, especially when I walk past playgrounds now. I think about how easily it could have gone differently, how vulnerable I was. I don't like to think about what might have happened if I hadn't kicked him in the balls, if I hadn't been able to get away. It's been years now, and I'm older, and I don't go to parks alone anymore. The world feels bigger, and there's so much more out there than what we see every day. But sometimes late at night, when the quiet sets in and the world slows down, I still remember the feeling of his hand on my leg, the way he wouldn't stop pushing me, and the way he'd tipped me off that swing. That memory still makes my skin crawl. It was just one of those moments that sticks with you forever. I had always been warned about walking around late at night in the city. The area I was in wasn't exactly the safest place in the world. This part of the town, down near the old factories and broken down buildings, was a place you kept your head down and your distance from anyone you didn't know. It wasn't just the sketchy characters on the corners or the broken streetlights that made it dangerous. It was the general sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air. People in the neighborhood were hardened by whatever their lives had dealt them: hunger, poverty, drugs, and violence. It was the kind of place where everyone knew to mind their own business, or else. But that night, I was just passing through. I was walking home from a bar, my head a little foggy from a few too many beers. The alcohol had made my senses a little duller, the kind of buzz where you don't notice the little things happening around you. The night was humid, thick with heat, and the streets were nearly empty. The air had that stale quality, the smell of old rain and exhaust fumes clinging to everything. The neon signs above the rundown stores flickered like they were on their last legs. The whole area felt abandoned, like the city itself was slowly giving up on it. I had been walking for a while when I noticed him. He was just standing there on the corner of an alley, leaning against a brick wall. The moment I saw him, a weird sensation crawled up my spine. Something about the way he was staring at me made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and his skin was pale, almost sickly looking, as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. His jeans were torn, and his sneakers looked like they had walked through hell. I couldn't tell his age exactly. He looked too rough to be much older than 30, but had the kind of wear and tear that could age someone much faster. I tried to ignore him, just keep walking, but as I passed him, he spoke. "Hey man, you got a light?" I didn't have a lighter on me, and I didn't want to stop walking, didn't want to engage. People like that, people hanging out on the street, looking like they were up to no good, didn't get anything from me. I kept walking faster, hoping he wouldn't follow. But then I heard footsteps behind me, slow at first, but gradually picking up pace. My pulse quickened, and I started thinking that maybe I had made a mistake by not acknowledging him. I turned my head just a little, enough to get a glimpse. He was right behind me now, just a few feet away, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was something strange about them, almost like he wasn't fully there, like he was lost in his own world. But then his hand moved, and I saw the glint of metal in the streetlights. He pulled out a knife. Not some little pocket knife, either. It was a long, gleaming blade, the kind that could do a lot of damage in the wrong hands. I froze, the blood draining from my face. In that moment, I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I didn't know if he was going to rob me, or if he was planning to do something worse. His eyes locked onto mine, and I realized then that he wasn't acting normal. There was something wrong with him. He looked high, or maybe just deranged. Either way, the look in his eyes told me one thing. He wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, and I didn't think he cared what it was. I glanced around. The streets were still empty. No one was going to come to help me. No one was around to see what was happening. My heart was racing, and my thoughts were scrambled. The rational part of my brain told me to just give him my wallet, to do whatever it took to avoid violence. But then another part of me, something deeper, something primal, kicked in. I realized in that split second that I wasn't just facing some guy who wanted my money. No, this was something worse. This guy wanted to hurt me, and that thought brought an icy calm over me. If I gave him my wallet, if I let him think I was weak or scared, there was a good chance he'd just stab me anyway. I had to show him that I wasn't afraid, that I wasn't going to back down. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the butterfly knife I carried with me. It was just a simple thing, really, but it was sharp. I had gotten it as a gift a few years back and had kept it on me ever since. I hadn't planned on using it, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing I had. He saw the blade and seemed to hesitate for just a moment. That brief pause gave me enough time to flip the knife open, the smooth motion of the blade clicking into place. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The weight of the knife in my hand felt reassuring, like I wasn't just some helpless person anymore. I was ready to fight back if it came to that. Want to tussle, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I wasn't sure what made me say that. Maybe it was the alcohol still in my system. Maybe it was just the fact that I didn't want to die tonight. But I said it, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I saw the shift in his posture. He took a step back, the knife still in his hand, but his eyes darted from the blade in my hand to my face. For a long second, he just stood there, and I thought maybe I'd caught him off guard. He was high or out of his mind, and now that he saw I wasn't going to be an easy target, he seemed to be reconsidering. Yeah, he muttered, almost to himself, yeah, you crazy. And then, without another word, he backed away, slow at first, then faster as he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the alley. I stood there for a few moments, my heart hammering in my chest. My hand still gripped the butterfly knife, but I couldn't seem to make myself put it away. I didn't know what had just happened. Had I scared him off? Was he going to come back with more people? Or had I just gotten lucky? I didn't wait around to find out. I slid the knife back into my pocket and took off down the street, walking faster now, my pace quickening with every step I took away from that alley. My mind raced, but all I could think about was getting as far away from that guy as possible. When I finally got to a busier part of the city, my breath was still shallow, my legs shaky. I sat down on a bench, my hands trembling, trying to calm down. I kept replaying what had happened over and over again in my head, trying to make sense of it. What if I hadn't had the knife? What if I had tried to talk my way out of it instead of showing I was ready to fight? The whole thing could have gone so differently. I had no idea how I managed to stay calm in the face of it all. Looking back, I didn't even feel all that cool. I felt lucky, like the smallest thing could have gone wrong and it would have been over. But in the end, I walked away. I was alive. That was all that mattered. There were no big lessons to take from it, no deep realizations. It wasn't some heroic moment where I proved something to myself or the world. It was just a scary thing that happened one night, and I'd gotten through it. I don't carry that butterfly knife anymore. I don't feel the need to prove anything. That night was a wake-up call for me, a reminder that sometimes the world can turn on you in an instant, and you have no control over it. I don't think I was brave or anything like that. I was just lucky, and that's the only reason I'm still here to tell the story. It was my first year of college, a time when everything felt new. I was nervous, unsure, but excited for what was to come. My first semester had been a blur of new faces, late nights, studying, and occasional awkward encounters with people I barely knew. Among those people was my roommate. His name was Mike, a quiet guy, kind of shy. We had only met a few days before move-in, through an online forum where we discussed which Super Smash Bros. Characters we played. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another guy with similar interests. We didn't really have a lot in common, but that wasn't a problem. We got along just fine. He was easy to live with, always polite, never too loud. He kept to himself for the most part, which was fine by me. I was the same way. We both stuck to our routines. I spent a lot of time in my room on my computer or gaming, and he would come and go, mostly disappearing with his friends. It was a normal college life, mundane but manageable. Then, one afternoon, something happened that changed everything. I was sitting at my desk, playing some game on my computer, just zoning out as usual. I had headphones in, so I didn't hear them coming at first. The door burst open with a loud creak, and 3 people walked in. Mike was leading the way, followed by 2 of his friends from back home. They looked serious, too serious for a group of college students. The kind of serious you don't see every day, the kind that makes the air feel thicker. Mike didn't say anything at first. He just stood there for a second, staring at me as if he didn't quite know what to say. And then he said, almost casually, as if the words were just coming out of his mouth without thinking, "My friend killed himself." It took me a second to process what he said. My brain didn't register the words at first, and I just stared at him. His friend stood behind him, also silent, their faces blank. The gravity of the situation hit me slowly. I didn't know his friend. I didn't know the person who had died, but somehow I could feel it, this sense of loss, of heavy weight in the room. It was like someone had just slammed the brakes on the world, and everything stopped for a moment. My mind raced, but nothing came to me. What do you say to someone who just lost a friend? How do you comfort someone in a moment like this? I wasn't prepared for it. No one is, I suppose. Even though I didn't know his friend, the quietness in the room felt suffocating. Mike didn't break down, didn't show any real emotion. He just moved to his desk, sat down, and started typing on his computer. His friend sat on the bed, silently looking at the screen over his shoulder. Apparently, the friend had left a message on his MySpace or LiveJournal or some other platform that was popular at the time. It wasn't a lot, just a few words, a few sentences that made everything real. The kind of words you read and feel something in your chest tighten. I felt completely useless. What do you do in a situation like this? I wasn't his best friend. I wasn't family, but I still wanted to help, to do something, anything to ease the tension, to make it less uncomfortable. I offered to drive him home. I didn't have a car at the time, but I told him I could lend him mine if he needed it. He didn't react, just nodded as he kept typing. His friend stayed quiet too, like they were waiting for something. But there was nothing to say. Nothing could fix this. As I sat there, I couldn't help but watch Mike. He seemed so detached, like he was on autopilot. Maybe it was his way of coping. Maybe he didn't know how to feel. But I could feel his pain in the air around us, like a thick fog that made the space feel smaller. The silence between us was unbearable. I had no idea what to do or say, so I just stayed in my chair, letting the moment stretch on. The strange thing was how normal it felt, in a way. The world kept moving, even though it seemed like time itself had stopped. Outside, people were walking by, talking, laughing. The sounds of college life continued, unaware of the tragedy that had just unfolded. Inside our room, though, it felt like everything was paused. The hum of the refrigerator, the click of Mike's keyboard, the occasional sigh from one of his friends. It was all there, but it didn't feel like real life. It felt like a dream, a bad dream that you can't wake up from. I watched them as they stared at the computer screen. I don't know how long we all sat there in that silence. It could have been 5 minutes, or it could have been an hour. Time didn't matter. The music from the webpage was the only sound breaking through the stillness. It was some kind of ballad, slow and haunting, the kind of song you hear at a funeral. I didn't know the band, but it fit the moment perfectly, like it was written specifically for this kind of sorrow. Eventually, Mike closed the laptop, but the quiet didn't leave. It was as if the silence had become a part of the room, woven into the walls and the furniture. His friends left soon after, offering no words of comfort, just a quick exit as if they couldn't stand being in the same space anymore. Mike stayed behind, his eyes staring at the screen, even though it was shut off. I sat there, unsure what to do. I didn't want to push him. I didn't want to ask him if he was okay, because I knew the answer already. No one is okay after something like this. I could feel his pain in my bones, even though I didn't know the person who died. And for a moment, I wished I did. I wished I could somehow understand what he was going through, even though I knew it was impossible. There was no way to make sense of it. Nothing about it made sense. That night, after everyone had left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what had happened, about Mike, about his friend. The emptiness in the room stayed with me, and I couldn't shake it. I could still hear that song in my head, the way it echoed in the silence, like it had been playing forever. I tried to distract myself, but nothing worked. I kept thinking about how someone could get to that point, to feel so alone that ending everything was the only option. It was a thought I couldn't escape. The next day, Mike wasn't around much. He came back to the dorm later in the afternoon, looking like he hadn't slept. He didn't say anything, just sat at his desk, looking at the computer again. I didn't ask him what he was thinking. I didn't push him to talk. I knew better by then. Sometimes, there's nothing you can say. Sometimes, the words don't exist to fix the brokenness. Mike and I didn't really talk much after that. He kept to himself even more, and I respected that. He needed space. But there were moments when I would see him staring out the window or sitting quietly where I could feel it again. The weight of what had happened, the heaviness in the air. It never really went away, not for him, and not for me either. It became a part of the dorm, a part of that year that couldn't be erased. I saw Mike a few times after that, in the months that followed. We still played games together, but the lightness wasn't there anymore. We both just went through the motions. I didn't expect things to be the same after what had happened, and they weren't. The world had shifted, and we were just left trying to figure out how to live in it again. Eventually, I moved out of the dorm. I never saw Mike again. I hope he's doing okay now, but I'll never know. The memory of that day stays with me, though, like a shadow that never leaves. It's a kind of sadness that doesn't go away even with time. There's no way to explain it, no way to prepare for it. It's just something that happens, and you have to carry it with you. The house where my parents have lived for almost 18 years is a place that's been the family for as long as I can remember. I'm 20 now, and though I don't live there anymore, my parents still do. To be honest, I've always had this strange feeling about that place, like it's sensitive to something that's always been just beyond my grasp. It's hard to explain. The whole family has experienced odd things over the years, though no one ever talked about it too much. I remember it more as a general unease. Nothing specific or conclusive. But one particular thing still haunts me. When my younger sister was a toddler, she went through this phase where she had terrible night terrors. I don't know exactly when it started, but I was around 10 and she was about 2 or 3 when it really began. Every night, without fail, I would wake up to her screams, piercing and frantic, like she was being chased by something she couldn't escape. It wasn't like normal nightmares. These were more intense, more like her body was trying to escape something in her sleep. She'd kick and cry, and sometimes she'd thrash around in the bed. I'd get out of bed, try to calm her down, but she was usually inconsolable. And when she finally woke up, she wouldn't remember anything about it. Not a single thing. This went on for what felt like years. It was hard on my parents, but they were always so tired, so used to it. At some point, I stopped asking them about it. I didn't know what they could say to make me understand it better. I just knew my sister's terror was a nightly thing, and that we'd all become accustomed to it. But something happened when she was 4, something that terrified me so deeply, I still think about it to this day. It was a normal morning, I think. I remember waking up to the smell of breakfast cooking downstairs. The sun had barely risen, but I could hear my parents talking in the kitchen. I got up, walked down the hall, and made my way to the kitchen table. My sister was already sitting there, playing with her cereal, looking like a normal kid for once. It was unusual, really. Usually, she was still out of it for whatever horror she'd endured the night before. But today, she was calm. My mother asked her how she had slept, casually, like it was a typical conversation for the morning. She was smiling, making light of it, like she always did. "How did you sleep, honey? You look so rested." Without skipping a beat, my sister, still only 4 years old, looked up from her cereal and answered in the most nonchalant way. "The good people came and told me not to listen to the bad people. They said they'd keep me safe." I froze. I didn't know why at first, but the way she said it made my blood run cold. My sister wasn't the type to say things like that. Not at that age. She was just a toddler, still innocent and pure. She didn't understand what she was saying, not really. But I did. The good people and the bad people. It sounded like something out of a story, something out of the sort of things people said when they were talking about things they didn't understand. But there was no way she could have known about that stuff. I looked at my mom, and for a moment, there was an odd silence in the room. My mother didn't seem alarmed, though. She just smiled at my sister and moved on, like it was no big deal. "Oh, sweetie, that's nice. What do you mean by the bad people?" she asked, but there was no worry in her voice. My sister just shook her head, not really giving an answer. It wasn't a thought-out response. It was like she didn't even understand why she said it. But I understood. I spent the rest of the morning in a sort of daze, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The words my sister had spoken echoed in my mind, over and over again. The good people came, the bad people. What did that even mean? I thought about the night terror she'd had, the way she'd scream and cry, and the way she'd act like she was fighting something unseen. The thought made me shiver. Later that day, I tried to bring it up with my mom, but she brushed it off. "Kids say all kinds of things, honey. Don't read too much into it. I didn't say anything else. I couldn't explain what I was feeling, even to myself. I want to believe my mom, but deep down, something told me that what my sister had said wasn't just some random thing. It wasn't just a childhood fantasy. It felt like a warning. Over the following days, I kept an eye on my sister. There were no more night terrors. She slept soundly every night, and I almost started to convince myself that maybe it was just a phase, that maybe she had somehow outgrown it. But then I began to notice other things. Small things. There were times when I'd be alone in the house, and I'd hear something, footsteps, the faintest whisper of movement coming from a room I knew no one was in. I'd check, of course, and no one would be there. The house would be empty, and I'd feel a chill creeping up my spine, like I wasn't truly alone. But it was so easy to ignore these things when no one else seemed to notice them. My parents were used to the creaks and groans of the old house, and my sister was too young to understand the discomfort that sometimes settled in the air. But then one night, I found myself alone in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. I was rinsing the dishes when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, half expecting to see my parents, but no one was there. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the empty doorway that led into the living room. And then, without thinking, I walked over and checked the whole house, room by room. Everything was still. Everything was fine. But that feeling, the one I couldn't shake, was still there. Days turned into weeks, and life went on. But the unease never fully left. My sister was still fine, still sleeping peacefully, and the strange occurrences seemed to fade into the background. Yet I couldn't forget what she had said. The good people came and told me not to listen to the bad people. It haunted me more than anything else. I don't know when it happened, but at some point, I realized that whatever my sister had experienced, whatever she had seen or heard, had changed things in a way that none of us understood. Maybe she had seen something, or maybe it was just her mind trying to make sense of the fear she felt. But whatever it was, it stayed with me. Years passed, and my sister grew up, as did I. We both moved out of the house, and the night terrors became a distant memory. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house still held something. Something that I couldn't see, but that was always there, lingering just beyond my perception. I never told my parents how deeply that day had affected me. How the words my sister had said seemed to unlock something I couldn't explain. I never brought it up with anyone, not even my sister. It felt too strange, too unsettling. And in some ways, I think I was scared that talking about it would somehow make it real. But every now and then, when I'm back in that house, when I walk through the rooms and feel the air grow cold, I think about what my sister said that morning. I wonder if those good people were somehow watching over her, or if, in some way, they were trying to protect her from something darker that none of us could understand. And I wonder if whatever was there, whatever was lurking in the background, is still waiting, still watching, still keeping its distance, waiting for the right moment. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand it. But one thing I do know for sure is that something was always off about that house, and whatever my sister experienced all those years ago is something I'll never forget. Something I'll never fully be able to explain, no matter how much time passes. Maybe some things are better left unsaid. Or maybe, just maybe, there are some things in life we're not supposed to understand. I was 17 when my dad moved into the house. It was the third or fourth house he had purchased in the last couple of years, though this one felt a little different. My parents had divorced years earlier, and I had gotten used to the split. My dad would buy houses that had clearly been abandoned or neglected for years, sometimes decades, and fix them up. He had a knack for seeing potential in these places, and he would do all the work himself. After a while, he'd sell them or rent them out for a lot more than he'd paid, sometimes making an absurd profit. That was his thing, fixing up old houses. He said he loved the challenge, but I always felt like it was just something to keep him busy. After all, he never really seemed at peace after the divorce, and the constant moving around, fixing up these houses, kept him distracted. This new house, though, was different. It wasn't some crumbling shack in the middle of nowhere. It was an older house, definitely, but it had this air of quiet charm, like it had once been loved and cared for. It was the kind of place that made you think of gardens full of flowers and family gatherings on summer afternoons. But despite that, it also had a sort of heaviness to it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as if the house was holding onto something that hadn't quite been let go of. My dad bought the house after its previous owner, an old woman, had passed away. From what I gathered, her family had put it on the market not long after her death. My dad didn't tell us much about the previous owner, but I remember him mentioning how the house had been in the same family for generations. The old woman had lived alone for years before she passed, and that made me feel a little uneasy when I first visited. I remember walking through the place on that first day and feeling like someone was watching me, though I couldn't see anyone. I wasn't the only one who felt uneasy, though. When my dad moved in, it was in the winter, and a few weeks after he got settled in, my two sisters and I stayed over for the weekend. The house was a little too big for just my dad to be there alone, and he had been talking about how much he missed us, so my sisters and I packed up our stuff for a couple of days. I remember that weekend clearly. The house felt cold, even though the heater was running, and it always seemed to be just a little bit darker than it should have been, even in the middle of the day. The walls were still a bit bare, and the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. My dad took one room, my two sisters shared another, and I had my own room upstairs. I remember the room felt drafty, and the bed felt too big for me. I couldn't get comfortable, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was missing something. I would wake up and stare at the ceiling, unable to fall back asleep, listening to the sounds of the house. On the first night, I kept hearing something. At first, it was so faint I thought it was just the wind, but after a while, I realized it was something else. It sounded like muffled voices, like someone was talking on the other side of the wall. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. It almost sounded like a low conversation or the TV playing from another room. I assumed it was my sisters or my dad. Maybe they couldn't sleep either, and I thought nothing of it. I lay there for a while, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to get comfortable again. But every time I would start to drift off, the voices would start again, and I'd lie there, wide awake, listening. The next morning, we were all sitting at the kitchen table, eating breakfast. I had barely slept, and the first thing I asked was, "Did anyone hear that noise last night? Like the TV or someone talking?" My dad and sisters looked at me strangely. They both said no, they hadn't been up. But then they both said they'd heard it too, this low, muffled talking in the middle of the night. It was the same sound I heard, and none of us had been able to figure it out. We assumed someone was up late watching TV, but no one admitted to it. That night, I heard it again, the muffled voices coming from somewhere in the house. It was getting harder to ignore, but I still thought it was just my dad or sisters. After all, the house was big and the walls were thin. But then the weirdest thing happened. A few days later, my dad was home alone and heard the voices too. He got up to investigate, thinking one of us had left the TV on, but when he went through the rooms, there was no TV on, no one awake. The house was completely silent. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with the place. As time went on, the whispers, because that's what we started calling them, became a regular occurrence. My sisters and I would hear them too, but none of us ever thought much of it. We had gotten used to the idea that the house was just old, and maybe the strange sound were just a part of it. But then things took a turn. After a few months, my dad had to have surgery. He had been having some health issues, and he was at home recovering. I stayed with him that weekend to keep him company, and I could tell he wasn't feeling well. The house was quiet for the most part, but that night, like every other night, we were awakened by the whispers. But this time, something felt different. Around 3 a.m., my dad woke up to a feeling that something wasn't right. He looked around the room, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, and that's when he saw it. A shadowy figure standing next to his bed. At first, he thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, but as he focused, he realized it was the figure of a woman. He described her as old, thin, and wearing a long dress, her face obscured in the shadows. She stood there, staring at him. He said that he could hear the whispers again, like they were coming from her, but they weren't words, just sounds, faint and indistinct. The figure didn't move for a while. Then, she turned and walked away, making a soft, shuffling sound that reminded him of the whispers we had been hearing all along. He told me later that it was the most unsettling experience of his life. But what struck him the most was what she said. He swore she looked at him, smiled just a little, and said, "You have a nice family. Thank you for taking care of my home." Then she disappeared into the shadows. That was the last time we ever heard the whispers. The following night, they were gone. Completely gone. We never heard them again. My dad's story was so vivid, so real, that I had a hard time dismissing it. I could see the fear in his eyes when he told me, and it made me wonder if there was something more to this house than we'd realized. Not long after that, we were in the attic, sorting through old boxes left behind by the previous owners. We had never gone up there before, but this time we needed to clean it out. It was a cramped, dusty space filled with forgotten things. As we dug through the boxes, we found old photographs, pictures of the house, and of the family who had lived there. There were faded images of the old woman, her face clearly visible in the photos, standing in front of the very house we were now living in. The strange thing was she looked just like the woman my dad had seen in the shadows that night. There was no denying it. This was the same woman, the one who had died in the house, the one whose family had sold it after her passing. The same woman who had been standing at my dad's bedside, watching over him, speaking to him. In the end, we never spoke much about it again. The whispers stopped, and we all just tried to move on. But sometimes when I think back on that time, I can't help but feel like the house was more than just a place. It was as if it was alive in its own way, holding on to memories, holding on to something that didn't quite belong to us. And even now, I'm not sure if I'll ever fully understand what happened that winter. The house is still there, standing tall like it always has. But it's not the same anymore. The memories of the whispers, the shadowy woman, and the strange feeling in that house linger in the back of my mind, as if the house itself still holds something from the past. Maybe we were just too blind to see it, or maybe we were just lucky it stopped when it did. But whatever it was, I think it's safe to say that the house will always have its secrets. It was the first day of the school holidays when my family and I made our way to Renmark. The small country town seemed like a perfect getaway from the bustling city life. It had that quiet charm with wide, empty streets, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else. My grandparents lived in one of those old homes on the corner, just a street away from the local park. It was a peaceful place, or at least that's how it seemed to me back then. The day was warm, the sun just starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over everything. My parents, my younger brother, and I decided to head over to the soccer pitch for a bit of fun. We hadn't done anything all day, and a game of kicking the ball around seemed like the perfect way to pass the time. The pitch was a wide, open space with a few goalposts at either end. It wasn't much, just a simple stretch of grass, but it was enough for us. My brother and I kicked the ball back and forth, laughing and joking around while my parents sat on the sidelines, enjoying the rare moment of peace. It was quiet out there. There were no other people around, not that I expected many. Renmark was the kind of place where you could walk down the street and not see another soul for hours. Still, the emptiness gave me a strange feeling, a kind of weight in the air, though I didn't think much of it at the time. After about half an hour, we decided to call it quits. The sun was lower now, and we had a long walk back to my grandparents' house. As we gathered up the ball and started heading toward the gate, I didn't notice the car at first. It wasn't until we were nearly out of the gate that I heard this soft hum of an engine. At first, I thought it was nothing. It was a quiet town, after all, and the streets were mostly empty. But when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw the beige car pulling out from behind some trees. It wasn't a fast, rush kind of motion. It was slow, almost deliberate, like it was trying to be unnoticed. The car crept up behind us, and I could feel a chill crawl up my spine. It was just a few feet away, close enough that I could see the dust rising behind it as it moved. The thing that unsettled me was how it moved so slowly, almost as if it was waiting for something, waiting for us to notice it. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to make my parents worry, but I could feel something strange in the air. It wasn't just the way the car moved, it was the way it felt. It was like something was wrong, like I was being watched, studied. I tried to ignore it, but the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. My brother noticed it too. He glanced at me, his face wrinkled in confusion. but I could see the worry in his eyes. We started to pick up the pace, walking faster, but the car did the same. It wasn't a coincidence. The car sped up just a bit, matching our pace. The engine revved louder now, the sound growing closer, more pressing. I turned to my brother, my heart beginning to race in my chest. "Let's walk faster," I said, though my voice trembled just a bit. My brother nodded, not saying anything, but I could see the fear written all over his face. He knew it too. There was something off about this. We picked up the pace to a brisk walk, but the car did the same, pulling up just a bit closer behind us. It was like it was toying with us, waiting for the right moment to make its move. The more we walked, the more frantic I became. I didn't want to turn around and look at the driver, but I couldn't help it. I kept stealing glances over my shoulder, each time hoping it would just go away, but the car kept following, getting closer. Then, just as I thought we might be able to outrun it, the car stopped. It wasn't a gentle stop either. It was abrupt, sudden, like the driver had slammed on the brakes. For a moment, everything went still. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. And then, in a move that made my blood run cold, the driver ducked. It was as if they were hiding from us, not wanting us to see them. But why? Why would someone hide if they weren't doing something wrong? The car sat there for what felt like an eternity. I could hear the soft hum of the engine as it idled, but everything else was silent. I couldn't understand why they weren't moving, why they were just sitting there, waiting, but I didn't want to stick around and find out. I looked at my brother. He was pale, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't need to say anything. We both knew it was time to run. "Run!" I shouted, though I don't think it was even loud enough for him to hear. But it didn't matter. We took off, running down the street, the sound of our feet pounding the pavement mixing with the ever-growing noise of the car as it revved back to life. I could hear it behind us now, the engine growling as it sped up, chasing us down the street. We ran harder, faster, my lungs burning, my legs aching, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear the car gaining on us, the sound of it getting louder with every second, like it was right on our heels. The fear in my chest was choking me. I wanted to scream, to call out, but all I could do was keep running, keep moving. We reached my grandparents' house, the old house that seemed like a safe haven in the middle of the madness. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short gasps, and as we reached the gate, I threw it open and slammed it behind me. The car screeched to a halt just as we did, its tires squealing against the pavement. I could see the driver now, just for a moment, as they sped past us. But there was no mistaking it. There was something wrong with that man, something wrong in the way he looked at us. His face was twisted, his eyes wide, and I could swear I saw a flash of something dark in them. He didn't stop. The car zoomed past us, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. But the horn honked loudly, cutting through the night, the sound ringing in my ears. And then the car disappeared into the distance, leaving only the sound of my own panicked breathing in the air. I collapsed onto the porch, my body shaking from the adrenaline, my mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. My brother sat down beside me, his face pale and silent. We never spoke about it again, not for years anyway. But it wasn't until last year that I found out just how close we had come to something terrible. A man had been caught in the Renmark area after attempting to abduct a child, and later, it came out that he had been stalking people in the area, looking for the right moment to strike. That was the kind of person we had run from that day. I shudder to think what might have happened if we hadn't been able to get to my grandparents' house in time. I never thought much of it at the time, but now, looking back, I realize just how lucky we were. Some people don't get that lucky. The house was always a little strange. I didn't think much of it when I was younger, but I can look back now and realize that it was never a place where anyone really felt comfortable. Not like the other houses I had been to. There was always something off about the place. And yet, I didn't understand it fully at the time. It started with the way the light hit the rooms. Every time I went over to my friend's house, it felt like the house was perpetually dim. The kind of dim where you never saw things quite clearly. Things would blur, the edges of furniture softened, and shadows seemed to hang around corners a little longer than they should. Sometimes it felt like something was watching you. I never mentioned it to anyone because I thought maybe I was just imagining it. After all, I was a kid. I didn't know how houses were supposed to feel, but I knew something was off. I had been there plenty of times before, during the day, for play dates or afternoon visits, and nothing seemed particularly strange then. The house was old, sure, the kind of place with creaky floors and narrow hallways that stretched forever. But when you're young, you don't think about those things. It's just a house, right? But the nighttime was different. My first sleepover at his house felt like it came up so suddenly. I had been excited at first. Who wouldn't be? It was a sleepover. I was going to stay up late, eat snacks, and hang out with my best friend. But as soon as the sun started to set, something shifted in the atmosphere. The house, which had seemed so familiar during the day, felt entirely foreign when the darkness crept in. There was a certain weight to the air, like it was thick with something you couldn't touch but could feel all around you. I remember walking into the living room after dinner, just as it got dark outside. The usual brightness of daylight was gone, and the room felt strangely muffled. Even the walls looked different, darker somehow. My friend didn't seem to mind, but I felt it in my stomach, that unease that crept up your spine like a cold draft, making you want to look over your shoulder. I kept noticing little things, the way the shadows played in the corners of the room, the weird creaks in the floorboards, how the air felt too still. I didn't say anything at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I felt watched, but I didn't want to admit it. I was a big kid now, and big kids didn't get scared at sleepovers. I kept playing with my friend, but there was always this nagging feeling that I couldn't ignore. I tried to focus on the game we were playing, but my eyes kept drifting to the hallway. It was dark at the end of the hall, and I could barely make out the shape of the door to the kitchen in the distance. I glanced back at my friend, but he didn't seem bothered by anything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we decided to call a night. My friend's parents had already gone to bed, and we figured we'd sleep in his room. But the way the house felt made me want to change my mind. I didn't say anything, though. I didn't want to seem like a baby. So we gathered our blankets and started to head toward his room. We had to walk through the kitchen to get there. I hated that kitchen. It was dark, and no matter how many times I went through it during the day, it always felt off. It wasn't even the kitchen itself, it was the door that led to the basement. There was always something about it that made me nervous. I couldn't say exactly what it was. It wasn't like I thought something bad was in the basement. I just didn't like being near it, like there was an invisible line I wasn't supposed to cross. We reached the kitchen, and as we passed by the door, I remember hearing the faintest sound. It was like a whisper, but it wasn't a voice, more like a shift in the air. I stopped walking and froze. My friend, who had been ahead of me, also stopped and turned back to look at me. "What's wrong?" he asked. I could see the unease in his face, too. We had both felt it, that subtle change in the air. He glanced at the door to the basement and shifted nervously. "I don't know," he said quietly. "This doesn't feel like the one that's usually here." Well, that did it. My stomach dropped. I wish he hadn't said anything, but now the air felt even heavier. That was the moment when I realized that something was definitely wrong with this house. I had no idea what, but I could feel it now. Something was waiting. And then it happened. The kitchen door to the basement slammed open, so loud that I thought the house might collapse. I jumped back, my heart racing, my breath caught in my throat. I looked at my friend, and his face was pale. He grabbed my arm, and we both stood frozen, staring at the dark opening in front of us. The light from the hallway barely reached into the basement, but I could see movement, something low to the ground, crawling. It was fast, and it moved in a way that didn't make sense. I couldn't really make out what I was seeing. It was too dark, but I could tell that whatever it wasn't human. It was on all fours, dragging itself in jerky movements down the steps. Its head didn't look right. It wasn't attached properly, as if it were hanging by some invisible thread, swaying unnaturally. I couldn't see its face, but I could see the outline of its body, long and thin, stretched out like it was more animal than person. The shadows around it seemed to grow darker as it moved, like it was feeding off the dimness. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. My friend squeezed my arm so hard I thought it might bruise. We both stood there, rooted to the spot, too terrified to move or even blink. I don't know how long we stayed like that, watching the thing on the basement steps, but it felt like forever. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. Was it real? Was I imagining it? And then it was gone. Just like that. It disappeared back into the basement, and the door slammed shut behind it with a force that rattled the walls. It was like the house had exhaled, releasing whatever it was that had been lurking down there. I didn't know what to do. My body was shaking, and I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. My friend didn't say anything either, but I could see the terror in his eyes. I knew we both saw the same thing. Neither of us spoke, but we didn't need to. We turned and ran as fast as we could down the hall to his room, slamming the door behind us. I don't remember much after that. I just remember pulling the covers over my head, trying to block out the feeling of eyes on me, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. We lay there, too scared to sleep, until morning came. The house was silent again, but the weight of the night stayed with me. The strange feeling didn't go away. I don't know if we were just scared kids or if something truly had been there, but I remember that night as if it were yesterday. It's been almost 15 years now, and I still haven't forgotten that feeling, the way the air thickened and how something seemed to be watching us. That thing in the basement, I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. My friend remembers it too. We talk about it every once in a while, and even now, when we bring it up, there's a look in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever we saw, whatever happened that night, was real. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a figment of our imagination. It was something that had been there all along, and we were too young to understand it. That night, my first sleepover, was something I'll never forget. It wasn't fun. It wasn't the adventure I thought it would be. And I'll never look at another house the same way again. Not after that. Hashtag the long ride. It was just after 4 in the afternoon when my brother, Jake, and his friend, Nick, left our house in Port Coquitlam. They had been planning the trip for a few weeks, excited to ride their bikes down the highway to Abbotsford. It was a Friday, and they were looking forward to spending the weekend with their buddy, Mark, who had recently moved there. The plan was simple: ride through the evening and night, and they'd get there around 2 or 3 a.m. They'd been talking about it all week, excited about the challenge and the adventure. For an 18-year-old, biking for hours across the country wasn't just a ride. It was a test of endurance. They loaded up their gear, packed a few snacks, water bottles, and a couple of light jackets for the chill that would eventually settle in as the sun went down. The weather had been perfect all day, warm but not too hot, and they figured the ride would be smooth, especially with the weather holding up. They checked their phones to make sure the GPS was set and double-checked their bikes for any issues. They were all set. I remember Jake telling me he'd call when they were halfway there or if anything went wrong. It was supposed to be a simple ride, just 2 guys on bikes cruising down the highway. They had both done this route before, but usually with a car. They never really thought it would be anything more than just a long ride in the dark. Hashtag a strange presence. By 9 p.m., the sun had dipped behind the mountains and the highway stretched ahead, dark and quiet. Jake and Nick were still cruising along, talking about everything and nothing, try to keep the mood light. They were used to the isolation, having ridden out there before on shorter trips. But something about tonight felt different. Jake mentioned that he felt like they were being followed, but Nick brushed it off. "It's probably just another car," he said, not thinking much of it. But as the minutes passed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling. The highway wasn't busy at night, especially not at that hour, but a car passed them, then turned around and came back, driving slowly past them again. They both looked at the truck, wondering if it was just some random person out for a drive, but the same vehicle passed them 3 more times in the next 20 minutes, always slowing down when it neared them. Each time, the truck's headlights washed over them, blinding them temporarily, but when the truck finally disappeared around a bend in the road, Jake couldn't help but feel uneasy. It wasn't the headlights or the slow speed that bothered him. It was the fact that the driver seemed to be watching them. Nick didn't seem as bothered. It's just a guy driving home. People drive this road all the time. But Jake knew something was wrong. Hashtag the chase. It was just past 11 p.m. when they saw the truck again. This time, it wasn't just passing them. It pulled off to the side of the highway, parking in a place where the darkness seemed to swallow up everything around it. The truck sat there for a while, and neither of them spoke. They kept pedaling, moving along, but both of them were watching that truck in the corner of their eyes. Nick tried to brush it off. It's probably just someone pulling over for a break. Don't worry about it. But Jake wasn't convinced. It felt too quiet, too deliberate. Suddenly, the truck's headlights flicked on again, but this time, it didn't just drive past. It followed them, slowly at first, but steadily. The road they were on wasn't lit, and with the truck behind them, they couldn't make out anything other than the faint shadows cast by their own bike lights. The air around them felt heavier. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their wheels spinning and the distant hum of the truck's engine. Jake kept pushing forward, urging Nick to go faster, his legs burning, but the truck kept pace, always staying just behind them, never getting too close, but never leaving. It wasn't until they reached a stretch of road where there was a slight bend, and the truck could no longer follow directly behind them, that they felt a brief sense of relief. That's when they heard it. The unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel. The truck had turned onto a dirt path and was coming after them. Fast. Panic set in. "Jake!" Nick shouted. "We need to get off the road." Jake didn't even answer. He just pedaled harder, his heart pounding in his chest as they veered off the road into the darkness of a nearby field, the sound of the truck getting louder behind them. The field was vast, but it was filled with tall grass and uneven ground. They couldn't keep riding through it, so they jumped off their bikes, abandoning them without a second thought, and started running. It wasn't long before the truck's headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the field like some kind of hunting spotlight. They could hear the engine rev as the truck tore across the grass behind them, but they didn't dare look back. They just kept running, jumping over barbed wire fences and dodging through the thick underbrush as they pushed their way toward the edge of the field. They ran for what felt like miles. Every time Jake turned his head to check their progress, he saw the truck's lights flickering through the trees, always too close. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned farmhouse. It wasn't much, but it offered them a place to hide. They crawled inside, hearts pounding, breathing heavy, and waited in the darkness. Hashtag the aftermath. They didn't hear the truck drive off. They couldn't be sure when it left or if it had ever really gone. But after what seemed like hours, Jake and Nick dared to peek out through a crack in the wooden walls. The truck was gone, and the only sound they could hear was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant chirp of a night bird. It wasn't until later, when they were sure the danger had passed, that they called home. Their voices shook as they explained what had happened, leaving out only the worst details. My parents were furious, worried, sick, and immediately called the police to make sure they were safe. The officers who responded to the call weren't surprised to hear about the truck following them, and they mentioned that there had been reports of a strange, unsettling man in the area. The next few weeks were a blur. It wasn't until months later that Jake saw the news report. They'd arrested Clifford Robert Olson, a man from the area who had been linked to a series of gruesome murders. The news outlet explained that Olson had been active for years, targeting vulnerable victims in the very area where Jake and Nick had been. The authorities had connected him to several crimes, and they strongly suspected that the man they had encountered on the road that night had been him. The same pickup truck, the same menacing behavior, the same predatory presence. That was the moment it clicked for Jake, the realization that they had barely escaped a predator, a man who had been known for his violent tendencies, someone who could have taken them without a second thought. It made Jake sick to his stomach. Hashtag closing. Jake and Nick never spoke much about that night. It haunted them both for years, a memory that would forever shape their view of the world. It wasn't until much later that they really understood the gravity of what had happened, that they had run across a man who wasn't just some random stranger. They had crossed paths with someone who had a history of horrific crimes. The type of person who would stalk and chase young men without hesitation. And the worst part, they never saw the man's face. He could have been anyone, just another person on the highway that night. But the fact that he had been in that truck hunting them is what terrified them the most. It was a close call, a terrifying one. And when Olson was eventually caught and linked to the murders, it sent a chill down their spines. They had been so close. So very close. I had just turned 16, and life had settled into a monotonous routine. School, homework, the occasional weekend with friends, and the constant stream of teenage thoughts fill my head. It was a typical Wednesday afternoon in early September when I made my way home from school, just like I had every other day. The streets were quiet, but I found myself feeling unusually restless that afternoon. Maybe it was the oppressive heat of the early fall or the fact that my mind was preoccupied with an upcoming math test I was dreading. Whatever it was, I walked through the bottom entrance of my street, not paying much attention to anything until I reached the point where I usually turned onto the familiar path that led up to my house. At the top of the street, my house stood alone on the hill, nestled between the quiet suburbs and the sprawling farmland that stretched out on the opposite side. The farmland had always felt distant, almost like another world. Most of the time, it was just a large, open field where I could see cows grazing or workers harvesting crops. It was nothing more than an unremarkable part of my daily landscape. That day, however, there was something different about the atmosphere. As I began to walk up the street, I noticed a strange sight. At the far end of the field, near the main road, there was a large white tent set up. The tent looked odd against the backdrop of golden crops. It wasn't just the tent that stood out, it was the sight of several police cars, their lights flashing in the afternoon sun. There were also several uniformed officers walking around, and a crowd of people had gathered nearby, their whispers cutting through the silence. My curiosity piqued. I instinctively slowed my pace as I neared the crowd. I could hear murmurs of conversation as I approached, but no one seemed to notice me at first. I stood there for a moment, just outside the small group, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Something felt off. Why were the police here? What had happened? I was too far away to hear the details, but the sight of the crowd made my stomach tighten with unease. It wasn't like this area to attract attention, let alone the police. Hey, I called out to one of the bystanders, a woman who appeared to be in her early 40s. She glanced over at me, her expression distant, as if lost in thought. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely louder than the hum of the passing cars. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward the field before she spoke in a quiet, almost detached tone. A body was found. One of the farm workers found a skeleton while they were harvesting the crops. The police think it's been there for a long time. I blinked, the words not fully registering at first. A body? How could that be? My brain tried to process the information, but the words felt disconnected, almost surreal. They think it might be someone who went missing. The woman continued, her voice a bit shaky. They arrested the farmer, but they're still investigating. I didn't know what to say. The thought of a body being found so close to my home, just across the street, sent a shiver down my spine. It was the kind of thing you only hear about on the news, not something that happened in your quiet little town. "That's creepy," I said, mostly to myself, but the woman nodded, her expression darkening. "Yeah, it's awful. We don't know what happened yet, but it doesn't feel right." I turned away from the group, my mind racing. I knew the farmer who worked that land, a quiet man who kept to himself. I couldn't imagine him being involved in something like this. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I had lived in this town my whole life, and I'd never imagined anything like this happening so close to home. It felt like a nightmare creeping into the real world, just a few feet away from my front door. As I walked up the street toward my house, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I couldn't help but glance over at the field, the white tent still standing ominously in the distance. It was strange, but I almost felt as if I could see the tent from my bedroom window, as if it had been placed there for me to see, a reminder of something I couldn't escape. When I got home, I rushed upstairs to my room, hoping to push the thought out of my mind. I didn't want to dwell on it. I had homework to do, after all, but as I sat down at my desk, my eyes kept darting back to the window. I couldn't help it. I knew that on the other side of the glass, something was happening, something that felt wrong, and yet I couldn't stop myself from watching. The next few days were a blur of police activity. Officers came and went, digging through the soil, searching for anything that might explain what had happened. The media arrived soon after, setting up cameras and interviewing people who had gathered in the street. The whole scene felt surreal, like it was happening in another world. But it was my world, the place where I lived, the place where I had grown up. The police were there for days, scouring the area for any sign of evidence. As the investigation unfolded, I found myself becoming more and more obsessed with the story. The news reports began to reveal more details about the body. It was the remains of a woman, a prostitute who had gone missing more than 10 years ago. The investigation quickly linked the body to a local serial killer who had been believed to be targeting women in the area, though the killer's identity had never been confirmed. The news was chilling, and the connection to the serial killer seemed to draw more attention to the case. The police eventually cleared the farmer of any involvement. They found no evidence linking him to the murder. Yet, the sense of dread lingered in the air. People continued to gather in the street, some curious, some mourning the lost woman. They laid flowers along the fence where her body had been found, a silent tribute to a life taken too soon. I couldn't stop thinking about the idea of the serial killer. I had read enough true crime stories to know that killers often return to the scenes of their crimes. The thought gnawed at me. Was one of those people who came to lay flowers really the killer? Was it possible that they had returned to the place where they had ended a life all those years ago, feeling the need to revisit the spot? The idea haunted me. For weeks, I watched from my bedroom window, the flowers piling up by the fence, the mourners who came and went. It felt like a scene out of a horror movie, but it was real, and it was happening right outside my house. My anxiety grew, and the sense of dread settled deep in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, something that had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. By the end of the month, the flowers had stopped coming. The crowds had dispersed, and the media had moved on to other stories. But the memory of those days lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that had settled over my once peaceful street. I couldn't shake the suspicion that I had been living so close to something terrible, something that I couldn't fully understand. The truth was that I had always felt safe in my little town, in my home at the top of the street. But now, I couldn't help but feel that something else was lurking just beneath the surface. The farmer was cleared, but I couldn't stop wondering who had killed the woman and why she had ended up in that field. I couldn't stop wondering if, one day, the killer would return. And maybe, just maybe, I'd see them again, standing among the mourners, laying down flowers, all while hiding their dark secret. That's the thing about living in a small town. You think you know everyone, think you know your neighbors, your streets, your world. But sometimes it's the things you don't see, the things that happen just out of view, that are the most dangerous. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't escape the feeling that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. It was late in the evening, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon when I found myself on the edge of a small creek that ran through my grandma's property. Her farm sprawled across several hundred acres of open land, tucked away in the southern part of Kansas. There were parts of it that felt timeless, places that looked just as they had decades ago. Rolling fields, dense woods, and the creek that I'd fished in since I was a kid. I had walked the creek for about an hour, the faint smell of damp earth and the sound of water trickling over rocks filling the air. I enjoyed these quiet moments by myself. It was one of those perfect, peaceful evenings, the kind that felt like you could be swallowed up by the night and no one would notice. The fishing had been slow, but I didn't mind. Sometimes it wasn't about catching anything. It was just about being alone with your thoughts in a place that had always been familiar. The weather had been warm, the sky was clear, and the trees around me, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze, cast long shadows as the sun faded. I had just hooked a decent-sized bass when it happened. I remember it clearly, almost too clearly. The fish was fighting on the line, but I wasn't distracted. I was focused on reeling it in, careful not to break the line. When I finally brought it close, I could feel the weight of it, the smooth, slippery skin of the fish beneath my hands as I prepared to release it back into the water. It was as I was letting it go, watching it disappear into the dark depths of the creek, that I noticed something moving across the creek on the far side. At first, I thought it was a deer. It was common to see them around here, and the shadows of the trees made it hard to make out any details. But then I saw it more clearly, and it made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't a deer. I froze. Across the creek, standing just on the edge of the water, was a creature. I could tell right away that something was wrong, that whatever it was didn't belong here. It was small, no more than 4 feet tall at most. Its skin was pale, almost sickly, like it hadn't seen the light of day in weeks. The color reminded me of a sick animal, something that was barely alive. I felt an immediate, intense unease ripple through me. This was no animal I recognized, no creature that belonged to this land. It stood there, facing me, and for a moment it didn't move. I could see its features, its head shaped like a hairless cat, its skin tight and gray. But the body was almost human-like. It had a strange, thin frame with long, gangly limbs. It wasn't exactly human, but it wasn't like anything I had ever seen in the woods before. The way it stood, its posture felt wrong, like it was something that shouldn't exist. The creature stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and I could see its eyes clearly. Dark, wide eyes that glinted in the dimming light. Its gaze was cold, almost knowing, like it was aware of my presence, and it didn't want me to be there. It wasn't just watching me, it was studying me. I could feel a sort of tension, like it was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. It was like it didn't want me to be a witness to whatever it was. And in that moment, I realized that this thing was not afraid of me. It wasn't scared of humans. In fact, it seemed irritated, like it was annoyed that I had seen it. Then it did something that made my stomach drop. The creature's head moved. It wasn't just a casual tilt. It rocked side to side, jerking in a rhythmic motion. The way it moved its head, like it was dancing, almost made me sick to my stomach. There was no reason for it to do that. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. It was like some kind of primitive, unsettling movement that didn't belong to anything that was natural. I knew then that whatever this thing was, it wasn't something I could handle. I had to protect myself. My hand instinctively reached down to my belt, where I kept a small fillet knife. I moved slowly, making sure to keep my eyes fixed on it. I didn't know what it was capable of, but I didn't want to give it the chance to make a move. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath quickening as I fumbled to pull the knife from its sheath. But even though I had the blade in hand, I knew deep down that it wouldn't do much if this creature decided to come at me. Then, without warning, it made a sound so high-pitched, so sharp, that it felt like it was cutting through my skull. It was an unnatural scream, unlike anything I had ever heard before. The noise seemed to reverberate in the air around me, and my mind couldn't process it fast enough. It was a cry of some sort, but it wasn't like an animal's roar or a bird's call. It was a raw, piercing sound that rattled me to the core. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and before I could even react, the creature turned and sprinted off into the woods. Its movements were fast, almost too fast, as it disappeared into the thick underbrush. The sound of its footsteps faded into the distance, leaving me standing there, frozen, the knife still clenched in my hand. For a long moment, I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was trying to wrap around what I had just seen, what had just happened. There was no logical explanation for it, nothing that made sense. The creature hadn't looked like an animal, but it didn't look entirely human either. It was something else, something that didn't belong in the woods of Kansas. When I finally came to my senses, I looked around, but there was nothing. No sign of the creature. The only sound was the rustling of the trees in the wind and the gentle trickle of the creek. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I quickly grabbed my gear and made my way back to my truck. Every step I took felt like it took me farther from the madness I had just witnessed. But in the back of my mind, I knew that it wasn't over. That thing was still out there, and I had seen it. I had been the one to look into its eyes, to feel the cold weight of its gaze. It had allowed me to see it, and for some reason, it had let me walk away. But I didn't think it would forget. The next few days were a blur. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not even my family. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but I knew that no one would believe me. It was just too bizarre. I didn't want to be the crazy person telling wild stories. But there were rumors. Others had seen lights in the woods near the creek. Strange flickering lights that didn't belong to any vehicle. They said they were from a strange source, but no one knew what they were. I didn't share my story with them either. I didn't want anyone to think I was making things up. I kept fishing in my grandma's place after that, but I was always more careful. I was always on edge, my eyes scanning the woods, always looking over my shoulder. And I always carried a gun with me. I never went fishing there without it again. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know what that thing was or what it wanted. But I know it wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a trick of the light. I know what I saw, and I will never forget it. I still don't know what it was, but I don't think I want to. Whatever it was, it's out there. And if I never see it again, I'll be just fine. But I'm not the only one who's seen strange things in those woods. That's what makes me wonder if maybe I wasn't the only one who had stumbled upon something that should have stayed hidden. And every time I go back to that creek, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I was driving across the state like I do every week. It's part of the job. I'm a paramedic, and I work at a hospital about an hour away from where I live. The drive's long, but it's not terrible. The usual route takes me down the interstate, past the usual towns, gas stations, and rest stops. The kind of places you don't remember after you pass them. But this time, something felt different. I had decided to take a different route that day, one that wasn't as well known. The interstate was backed up, as usual, and I thought I could make up some time if I cut through the back roads. I'd done it a few times before, taken a detour to get around the traffic and avoid the usual mess. These back roads weren't used as much, and the further I drove, the more isolated it became. I passed a few dilapidated farms. Then the landscape turned into nothing but trees and open fields. It was quiet. I kept the windows rolled down, the air warm but not too hot, and the sound of the road under my tires was the only thing I could hear. The highway's buzz was behind me now, and out here, it was just the occasional rumble of the engine and the distant sound of birds. It wasn't the first time I'd taken these roads, but it was the first time I really noticed how empty everything seemed. I passed a few more miles, and then took a sharp left onto a dirt road. The kind of road where your tires kick up dust as you drive. It felt strange at first, but nothing alarming. I was just trying to make good time. And that's when I saw it. A wreck. I slowed down instinctively. It was odd. 3 cars had crashed into each other. It wasn't just a fender bender, but a full-on pileup. The wreck was spread across the road, and from a distance it looked bad. There were no ambulances or police cars around. Just a few cars turned on their sides and scattered, with bodies lying in the middle of the road. Something didn't sit right about it. You get a feeling for these things after a while. Being in emergency services for years, you develop this sense that tells you when things aren't as they seem. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but the wreck seemed staged. It looked too perfect, too arranged. The cars were all placed in a way that made it seem like someone had set them up. I didn't know what to make of it, but I had a job to do. I was a paramedic. I didn't hesitate to make the decision to stop and help. I pulled over, parked just a few feet away from the crash, and got out. My heart was already pumping faster, but I had no choice. There were people down, and that's what I do. I help. I took a quick glance at the scene. Nothing seemed immediately life-threatening, at least not from what I could see. There was no obvious blood, no obvious injuries that stood out. But something was off. I took another step forward, and that's when I caught movement in the rearview mirror. It didn't make sense at first. I could see the bodies. They were sitting up. I stopped dead in my tracks. The bodies were sitting up. All of them. Every single one of the people who had been lying on the road a second ago was now sitting upright, staring at me. My heart sank. I had a bad feeling in my gut now, but I couldn't turn back. This was what I was trained to do. I took another step forward, trying to force my body to move, trying to ignore the fact that the people in the wreck were now watching me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed more movement. The bushes near the wreck rustled, and before I could fully comprehend what I was seeing, people started emerging from the trees and underbrush. Dozens of them. They just came out, slowly, like they had been waiting, like they had all planned this moment. I couldn't make sense of it at first. My brain just couldn't process what was happening. There were men, women, some in ragged clothes, others looking like they hadn't bathed in weeks. They were all staring at me. I remember my hands shaking, feeling my breath tighten in my chest. It was like the air around me had thickened, and I couldn't get enough of it. These people, the ones who had just been lying on the road, were now upright, their eyes locked onto mine. The others had emerged from the trees, surrounding the wreck. I looked around, my body on autopilot now, desperate for some kind of escape. They weren't talking, they weren't moving. They just watched. A dozen faces, maybe more, all locked onto me, unblinking. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Then I heard it, the snap of a twig behind me. I spun around. There was nothing there, just trees, nothing that made any sense. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a wreck. This wasn't a car crash. It wasn't an accident. This was all set up. A hoax. A sick, twisted game. They were playing with me. They had planned this out. The wreck, the bodies, the people coming out of the woods. It was all staged. A setup to lure in someone like me. A paramedic who would stop to help. Someone who would take the bait. Someone like me who had spent his life saving others. It was then I realized how deep I was in. I couldn't trust anyone here. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't leave right now, I wasn't going to make it out of here. I bolted. I didn't think. I didn't question. I didn't look back. I ran to my car, jumped inside, slammed the door, and slammed my foot on the gas. My heart was racing, my hands still trembling, my mind still spinning, but I knew if I didn't get out of there, I wouldn't make it out at all. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I don't know what would have happened if I had. Maybe they would have chased me. Maybe they would have caught me. Maybe they just wanted to scare me. But I wasn't sticking around to find out. I sped down the dirt road, my car kicking up rocks and dust, and as the distance grew between me and them, I couldn't shake the image of their eyes, those vacant, eerie stares as they just watched me. It felt like they were still out there, watching me, waiting. I don't know who they were or what they wanted. I don't know how they pulled it off or why they did it. But I know one thing for sure. This wasn't an accident. It was a trap, and I was lucky to get out of there alive. So if you're ever driving through the back roads, especially in isolated areas, just remember what I saw. Not every wreck is what it seems. Not every body lying on the road needs help. Some things, some people just want to see how far they can push you. And I learned the hard way that you never know when you're the one being watched. Because I know they were watching me, and I know they still are. I remember it well. The summer I spent working at that movie theater. It was my first job after my freshman year of college, and it wasn't anything glamorous. In fact, I would have rather been doing almost anything else. But my friends and I had a deal. We'd work as morning cleaners at the local theater, a fairly new building that had been built in the early 90s. It wasn't much, just 3 big screens for mid-sized ones and a handful of smaller theaters. It was tucked away on the outskirts of town, practically in the middle of nowhere. Getting there took about 20 minutes by car, and as I would drive in the early mornings, I always noticed the eeriness of the area. Before the theater was built, it was nothing but wetland and farmland, and the land was still owned by the nature center. There was a feeling about that place, something that lingered even though I couldn't place it at the time. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. We were a small crew of early risers, just a couple of us on each shift. My job involved cleaning the theaters after the late night showings, sweeping up the mess of popcorn, candy wrappers, and empty cups. It was a solitary job most of the time. I put on my iPod, plug in my headphones, and lose myself in the cleaning. Sometimes I'd run into the day shift workers, and we'd chat briefly about maintenance issues or other minor things. It was monotonous, but at least it paid the bills. We didn't have to deal with many customers at that hour, so it felt almost like we had the whole place to ourselves. But then there was the strange thing about the front doors. My boss, Jeff, mentioned it one morning just as I was finishing sweeping the lobby. Apparently, customers, mainly women, had been complaining about a tall, lanky man in a suit who had been following them from theater to theater. Some said he even followed them into the bathroom. They described him as being at least 7 feet tall, wearing a black suit and a bowler hat, and walking with an unnerving, slow pace. A few women had come to the front desk, visibly shaken, claiming he had been lurking in the theaters or walking behind them in the hallways. There were even a few times when the police were called, but they could never find anyone. Some of the other workers had spotted him too, but when they tried to approach, he would disappear as if he had melted into the walls. The other staff called him the tall man, and while he seemed to target women, occasionally a male coworker would spot him too. But whenever anyone tried to track him down, the man was gone, as if he had never been there in the first place. It wasn't a joke to anyone who worked there. It was unsettling. It was around this time that I learned about Theater 5, a room that everyone seemed to avoid. I didn't understand why at first. Theater 5 wasn't anything special. It was located at the back of the building, past the bathrooms and the lobby. To get to it, you had to walk down a long hallway, isolated from the rest of the theaters. The isolation made it feel more distant, and it didn't help that, for whatever reason, workers would complain about feeling watched when they cleaned it. Others said they had experienced nosebleeds and constant headaches. Some of them swore the air in that room was thicker than in the others. I was too naive back then to understand, but soon enough, I would get a crash course in what people had been talking about. I was assigned to clean Theater 5 one morning, and though I didn't know it yet, it would be the start of something I couldn't explain. I had just finished sweeping the lobby when I made my way to the theater. The job was simple: pick up the trash, vacuum the floor, and get out. I had my iPod on, lost in my thoughts, moving from row to row, tossing discarded cups and bags into the trash. It was quiet, the only sounds being the hum of the theater's air conditioning and the soft shuffle of my sneakers on the carpet. But something was off. I had the strange sensation that someone was behind me. I kept turning around, expecting to see a coworker or maybe a late-night moviegoer, but every time I looked, there was no one there. I even pulled my earphones out just to listen for a moment. "Hello." I called, but there was no answer. The feeling didn't go away, though. It clung to me, a sense that I wasn't truly alone. Eventually, I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I continued cleaning, moving toward the back rows, where the garbage always seemed to pile up more. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Someone running. It wasn't a slow, casual walk like I would expect from someone cleaning. This was fast, frantic. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced down the aisle. I saw him, a little blonde-haired boy, maybe no older than 7, darting out of the theater and into the hallway. Without thinking, I dropped my broom and rushed after him. I chased him down the hallway, heart pounding in my chest. I thought he might have gotten lost or snuck in from another theater, and I needed to make sure he was okay. But when I reached the end of the hall, there was no sign of him. I looked around, calling out, but the lobby was empty. I saw Jeff, my boss, standing outside by the front doors, having a cigarette. "Who was that kid?" I asked, catching my breath. Jeff didn't seem surprised at all. For a moment, he stared at me. Then a slow grin spread across his face. "Oh, so you met Charlie?" Charlie, apparently, was another mystery. Customers had complained several times about seeing a little boy running around in Theater 5, causing disruptions during movies. The thing was, whenever staff tried to catch him, he was always gone, like he vanished into thin air. Some of the female employees had even named him Charlie, after Charlie from Willy Wonka, because of his blonde hair and mischievous nature. Charlie wasn't exactly a terrifying figure, more of a nuisance. But the real question was, why did he always appear in Theater 5? And why did I feel so uneasy every time I cleaned that room? I didn't think much more about Charlie, but I would soon learn that he wasn't the worst thing lurking in that theater. A few weeks later, I had my first real encounter with the tall man. I'd already heard the stories by then, but I was still skeptical. I didn't know the full details, only that people had seen him around, always at a distance, always lurking. The night of the encounter, I was the first to arrive at the theater. My job was to go up to the projector rooms and turn on the lights in all the theaters, which I had done many times before. The projector rooms were upstairs, and it was always dark up there, with the occasional life-sized movie cutout of famous characters hanging in the halls. It could be creepy, especially in the silence of the early hours. I had forgotten my flashlight, which I usually carried with me, so I just used my phone's flashlight to find my way through the dark corridor. I remember feeling unusually off that night. The air felt thicker than usual. As I walked down the long hallway, flipping switches, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the usual sense of being alone in a large building. This was different. It felt like someone or something was watching me. I shook it off, attributing it to fatigue, but when I passed one of the cardboard cutouts of a character from an old movie, I froze. It wasn't a cutout at all. It was a man, hunched over, eerily mimicking the whistling tune from the Andy Griffith Show, the song I had been whistling earlier. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure. He was tall, so tall that he had to be crouching. His shoulders hunched as he continued whistling, slowly and methodically, his body swaying slightly as though he was imitating my every move. Then he straightened up, revealing a lanky, gaunt figure standing at least 7 feet tall. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could make out his bowler hat and the faint outline of a suit. My feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was frozen. The man, asterisk the tall man asterisk, took a few slow steps toward me. His eyes, though obscured by the shadows, seemed to focus on me. The eerie whistling grew louder until he was only a few feet away. Then, without warning, he turned and walked down the hall, disappearing into one of the offices. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, heart pounding in my chest, too terrified to follow him or move at all. Finally, I snapped out of it. I ran down the stairs, heart racing, and waited by the front entrance until my boss and the rest of the crew arrived. I told them everything that had happened, but they just nodded, as if this was something they had expected all along. Jeff explained that the tall man was part of the building's odd history, but that he wasn't harmful. That did little to ease the sense of dread that had taken over me. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back. It didn't matter that I hadn't seen any ghosts or anything truly supernatural. What I had experienced was real, and it left me with an unease that I couldn't shake. The idea that someone or something had been watching me in that dark theater, mimicking my movements, was enough to make me quit. I handed in my 2 weeks' notice the very next day, and I never looked back. When I was around 9 years old, I had a room that I hated. It wasn't that there was anything obviously wrong with it. It was just unsettling. Looking back now, I can't quite pinpoint what it was that made the room so terrifying to me, but there was always this unease that would crawl up my spine whenever I was alone in there. It wasn't the kind of fear that would make your heart race or your body freeze up in terror, but more of a constant, creeping anxiety that you couldn't quite shake. It was a quiet, persistent feeling that something wasn't right. The room itself wasn't anything special, just a small, plain, blue room with hardwood floors. The walls were a dull shade of blue, a color that never felt calming, but instead added to the sense of isolation. The floor creaked when you walked on it, and the furniture was sparse: a dresser, a small nightstand, and a bed with a top bunk that I liked to sleep on. The bed was just a standard wooden frame with a thin mattress. There wasn't much to it, but it was mine. I guess the fact that I never felt comfortable in it is what always stuck with me. It was a room you wouldn't mind if you had to spend a night in, but you wouldn't want to spend too many nights there either. I don't remember when exactly the unease began, but I know it started gradually. I would sit on the floor, maybe doing homework or playing with toys, and something would feel off. The longer I sat in that room, the more I started to notice small things. The way the shadows seemed a little too long, how the room felt too still, how the silence would hang around like something was waiting for me to break it. Even as a kid, I didn't have the words for it. I didn't understand why it made me feel so anxious. I just knew that something about that room, about being alone in it, felt wrong. There was one part of the room that really got to me, the small cabinet next to the bed. It was a flimsy wooden door that led to the space under the bathtub. I never really thought much of it until I started noticing the bugs. At first, it was just the occasional spider, but then it was more than that. The cabinet was a passageway for things. I don't know where they came from, but they'd crawl out and scurry across the floor, sometimes getting caught in the light of my radio. It wasn't uncommon to hear the scuttling sounds in the night. The bugs never seemed to stop, and the thought of them crawling across the floor while I was asleep became something I dreaded. To avoid them, I'd always run to my bed when I had to go to it. If I had to use the bathroom at night, I'd race down the hall, jump back into my bed, and pull the covers over me as quickly as possible. The idea of bugs crawling on me while I walked across the room made me feel sick. So, I stayed up late sometimes, reading in the dark with a flashlight, just so I didn't have to think about the bugs or the empty space in the room. I was always cautious of the door, too. I always kept it open. I don't know why, but it made me feel less trapped, I guess. The hallway outside my room was dark, but it felt less suffocating than the room itself. If I kept the door open, I could at least hear if someone was walking by. I don't think I realized it at the time, but I think I kept it open because the room made me feel so alone, and I didn't want to feel completely isolated. I wanted to know that someone could get to me if I needed them. I don't really remember much from the year I lived in that room, but I do remember the fear that lived in the corners of the room. It was a subtle fear, a constant presence. Sometimes I would find myself staring into the dark hallway, try to reassure myself that I was just being paranoid. It wasn't until the night before I left that I realized how deep my fear had gone. I was sitting on the top bunk one evening, reading a book by flashlight. The room was silent, and the quiet was so thick it felt almost oppressive. It was late. I didn't really have anything pressing to do, and I'd grown used to the long, lonely hours at night. My eyes were getting heavy, and I could feel myself starting to drift off when I heard something. It wasn't loud at first, just the sound of footsteps on the stairs. At first, I thought it was my sister. She'd come home late sometimes, and it was normal for me to hear her footsteps. But as the steps got closer, something felt wrong. The sound was too heavy, too deliberate. It wasn't the light, hurried steps I was used to hearing from my sister. This was different. The steps stopped right outside my door. I remember my heart racing a little faster. It was like my body knew something I didn't. I held my breath, not sure what to expect. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop. A voice. A soft, tentative hello was whispered from the hallway. I don't know why, but I didn't respond. I didn't move. I just stared into the dark hallway, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or the house settling, but there was something about the voice that didn't feel right. It wasn't like the voices I'd heard before, those familiar, comforting sounds from my family. This was something else. The dark shape of my door appeared next. It wasn't a person, not really. It was like a figure made of the darkness itself, standing there and blocking the little light from the hallway. I could see the outline of it, but there was nothing solid about it. It wasn't human shape, but it was enough to make me freeze. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't tell you why, but I was suddenly terrified. My throat went dry, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. It just stood there, motionless, as if it were waiting for something. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at it. The figure started to move, slowly and deliberately, toward the bed. It was like it was walking right through the room, but it didn't touch anything. It didn't cast a shadow. It was just darkness. I remember the flashlight shaking in my hand, my mind screaming for me to do something, anything, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. When the figure got closer, I reached out and swung the flashlight. It hit the thing, but it didn't do anything. It didn't flinch, didn't react. The beam of light lit up the floor around it, but the figure remained as dark as ever. I could see the room around it, but not the figure itself. It was like the darkness refused to be illuminated. I cried out. I don't remember how or when, but the next thing I knew, my parents were rushing into the room. The door slammed open, and the figure was gone. The hallway was empty. It was like nothing had ever been there. My dad flicked on the lights, but the room looked the same as it always had, plain, empty, and unremarkable. I don't know what happened that night. Part of me wants to believe it was a bad dream, just a figment of my imagination, but it felt so real. The fear I felt was so intense, so palpable, that it stayed with me long after the figure had disappeared. My parents never really questioned me about it. I didn't tell them much. They were just relieved that I wasn't hurt. The next day, I moved into a new room. I remember feeling a weight lift off my chest as I stepped into the new space, like I could finally breathe again. I didn't feel that same creeping anxiety. I slept better, and the room didn't make me feel like I was being watched. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. As I got older, I convinced myself that it had all been a bad dream, just my imagination running wild. But the fear I felt in that room, how real it was, how intense it was, never really went away. Sometimes I still think about that figure and wonder if it was something more than just a nightmare. But I'll never know for sure. All I know is that after that night, I was never the same in that room again. I left it behind, and I didn't look back. Years later, when I visited the house again, I couldn't bring myself to go into that room. I walked past it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a room. It had been more than that to me, something that had become entwined with my fear, something that I'd never fully understood. But I knew that I was done with it. I would never return to that room. I was about 8 or 9 when it happened, right in the middle of one of those dark, quiet nights that always seem to stretch on forever. I was in my room, lying in bed, the usual quiet of the house settling in around me. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant buzz of the street lights outside, and the occasional creak of the house settling. I was used to all that, the kind of noises that were easy to ignore, the kind of noises that didn't stir any concern in a kid's mind. But this night, it was different. It started with a sound, a soft, almost rhythmic noise. At first, I thought I was imagining it, maybe dreaming. It was a strange sound, something like the clinking and clattering of small plastic pieces being shuffled around. It was familiar, but at the same time strange. It was like the sound you make when you're playing with Legos, picking them up, putting them down, clattering them together. But it was louder than normal, and it didn't stop. I was terrified of everything back then. Every little thing made me jumpy, from the sounds of the house to the shadows in the corners. But this was different. It wasn't just the noise. It was the feeling that something wasn't right, that someone or something was in the house with me. I stayed still for a moment, my heart racing, straining my ears to hear the noise more clearly. It was coming from the living room, just down the hall. I was frozen for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe one of my toys had fallen off a shelf. Maybe it was just the house creaking. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. My room was at the end of the hallway, past my brother's room, and just before the living room. The house was quiet at night, so it felt like the noise was amplified, echoing through the dark spaces of the house. I lay there still listening. It was faint but constant, like the sound of small objects being moved around, shuffled, maybe even thrown. My eyes darted around my room, trying to find something to focus on to calm myself down. But nothing helped. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the living room. The kind of feeling that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and your body freeze in place. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I was terrified. My chest tightened, and my hands gripped the blanket beneath me as if I could somehow squeeze the fear out of my body. I bolted out of bed, not bothering to be quiet. I dashed for the door of my room, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor. I didn't care if my parents heard me. I needed to get to them. I ran down the dark hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. My brother's door was open, and I stopped for a moment, peering inside. The room was dark, the soft rhythm of his breathing the only sound. He was sound asleep, curled up under his blankets. My parents' room was at the end of the hall, just a few steps away, but I couldn't help feeling this overwhelming need to check on him, even though I knew he was asleep. I took one last look and hurried to my parents' room. I threw the door open, not bothering to knock. I jumped into bed between them, the covers cold and stiff, my legs tangling in the sheets as I scrambled for comfort. My mom barely stirred, her breathing steady and slow. My dad didn't wake either. I tried to shake them awake, gently at first, then a little more urgently, whispering their names, but they didn't respond. They never responded. It was like they were in some kind of deep, peaceful sleep, completely unaware of the world around them. My fear was growing. The noise from the living room didn't stop. It was still there, muffled through the walls like small plastic pieces being scattered and rearranged. I tried to close my eyes to block it out, but every time I thought I could drift off to sleep, the noise came back, louder this time. It felt like it was getting closer, like whatever was making the sound was moving toward my room. I couldn't do it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I had to see for myself. I pulled the blankets off and crept out of bed, careful not to make a sound. I tiptoed down the hallway, my breath shallow and quick. The house felt different now. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air heavier, as if something was watching me from the shadows. But I had to know what was making that noise. I couldn't just lie there, waiting. I reached the corner of the hallway, just before the living room. I stood there for a moment, listening, trying to steady my breath. The noise was louder now, more distinct. It was definitely Legos. I could hear them clinking together, being stirred, moved around. It sounded like someone was sitting in the middle of the living room floor, playing with them. But it was so late, and no one was supposed to be awake. I peered around the corner, my heart in my throat. And what I saw nearly made me fall to the floor in terror. There was a chubby kid, his back to me, sitting on the floor of our living room. He was stirring a large bucket of Legos with a pen, shuffling them around, like he was making something. He was so focused on what he was doing that he didn't notice me standing there, frozen, just a few feet away. I could barely breathe. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing. Who was this kid? How did he get in the house? Why was he playing with my Legos in the middle of the night? I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like they were made of jelly, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at him, trying to figure out if this was some kind of dream or nightmare. Was I hallucinating? Was I imagining this? It didn't make sense. None of it did. But the kid didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. He just sat there, hunched over, the clinking of the Legos the only sound in the room. I didn't know how long I stood there, watching him. Every second felt like an eternity. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of everything. Finally, I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't care if the kid heard me. I just ran as fast as I could, my feet slapping against the floor, until I burst into my parents' room again. I jumped into bed, pulling the covers over my head. I was shaking uncontrollably now, my body tense and rigid, but I couldn't tell anyone. I couldn't make sense of what I'd just seen. I couldn't explain it. My parents were still asleep, completely oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded in the next room. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself that it was just a bad dream. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just seeing things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. I knew what I had seen. Eventually, my mom got up. I don't know how much time passed, but I could hear her moving around the house, the creak of the floorboards as she made her way to the living room. She didn't wake me up. I just lay there in my bed, too afraid to move. She came back a few minutes later, walking back into the room. I didn't ask her anything. I didn't need to. I already knew. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at me. I heard her tell my dad that the bucket of Legos had been tipped over, the small plastic pieces scattered all over the floor. But she didn't mention the kid. She didn't say anything about the pen or the figure I had seen sitting there in the dark. I never saw the kid again. I never told anyone about that night, and I never spoke of it again. But every time I think about it, I remember the fear that I felt, the terror of seeing someone in our house who wasn't supposed to be there, someone who shouldn't have been there at all. It never made sense, and I don't think it ever will. But one thing I know for sure, it was real. That night was real, and I'll never forget it. It started back in high school, the fall of my junior year, when everything felt like it was just waiting to happen. Me and my two closest friends, Brian and Eric, were always out driving around, especially after school or on weekends. We didn't drink or smoke or anything like that back then, but we were always looking for something to do, some kind of trouble that didn't really get anyone hurt. Just the usual teenage restlessness in a small town where everything looked the same no matter which direction you drove. One day, Eric told us about this old house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't really in the woods, but it was down this back road with a bunch of tall trees on either side that made it feel more hidden than it really was. From the road, you could barely see the house unless you knew where to look. He said he found it while riding his bike one summer and had gone in once just to check it out. Said it was empty and creepy as hell. So that weekend we all went together. I remember it had rained a day or two before, and the gravel on the shoulder was still damp. We parked Brian's truck off the road, half hidden behind some overgrown bushes, and walked up this long, weedy driveway. The house was 2 stories, pretty plain looking with white paint peeling off in strips, and one shutter hanging half off a window on the top floor. The front porch was soft and sagging, and the screen door was bent like someone had kicked it in at some point. Inside, it was exactly what you'd expect from a place left alone for years. There were old chairs tipped over, crumpled newspapers, mold on the ceiling corners. The smell was what got me first, a mix of mildew, dust, and something like dead leaves. We didn't stay long that first time, just walked around the ground floor and poked our heads into a few rooms. A lot of junk, but nothing interesting. The upstairs felt more dangerous with the way the floor groaned under our weight, so we didn't go up. The part that stood out most, though, was the basement, or more specifically, the door to the basement. It was on the side of the house, one of those modern walkout basement styles where the house is built into a slope, so the backside opens up at ground level. The door was solid wood, gray with age, and it had a long board nailed across it, running diagonally from top left to bottom right. Big rusted nails drove it into the door frame. It looked like it had been that way for years. No chance it was coming off easily. I remember we all stood there, just staring at it, like the way you look at something you know is important, but you don't know why. Anyway, we didn't mess with it that day. Just looked and joked about what might be down there, meth lab, raccoons, a stash of porno mags from the 70s. We laughed it off and left, but stayed on our minds. Over the next few weeks, we went back to that house a couple more times. We were getting bolder each visit, going upstairs, digging through drawers, trying to piece together who might have lived there. One room had faded wallpaper with little green trains on it, like a kid's room. Another had a mattress with no sheets, just stained foam. At some point, we decided we needed to see what was in the basement. It wasn't even a decision, really. It was just something that built up over time like pressure. So one Saturday, Brian brought a crowbar from his dad's shed. He handed it to me like it was some kind of weapon, but I think we all knew it wasn't going to be that dramatic. The wood on that door was soft with age. I pried it at the corner where the board met the frame, and the whole thing creaked like it hadn't moved in decades. The nails gave way one at a time, long orange streaks of rust grinding out of the wood. It took about 5 minutes total. When the board finally fell off, the door just sagged open an inch on its own. The smell hit us first, damp and stale, but colder than the rest of the house, like the air hadn't been touched in forever. We looked at each other, and then Brian pulled the door the rest of the way open. The basement wasn't that big, maybe the size of a regular living room, but it felt deeper than it should have. The ceiling was low, and there were wooden support beams spaced evenly along the middle. The whole place was coated in dust. Shelves lined one wall with random junk, old tools, paint cans, empty jars. There was a broken lawn chair on its side, and a couple of cardboard boxes caved in on themselves with water damage. But right in the middle of the concrete floor, in a small cleared space, was this piece of paper with something drawn on it, and sitting directly on top of it was a single red rose. We all froze. Nobody said anything. The paper was clean, bright white like it had just been printed, and the rose, plastic we could tell from the shine, looked brand new. No dust on either one, not even around it. The floor was gray and dirty everywhere else, but the spot around the paper was clean, like someone had brushed it off carefully. It didn't make any sense. The board had been nailed shut for years, maybe longer. Nobody had been down there. I remember getting this weird, tight feeling in my chest. I wasn't scared, exactly, but I didn't want to be there anymore. None of us did. Brian stepped closer and nudged the paper with the toe of his shoe, flipping the rose off of it. The symbol on the paper was a pentagram, drawn in thick black lines with odd little shapes around the edges, like crude symbols or maybe just scribbles. It wasn't a star drawn by a kid. It was symmetrical, sharp, and deliberate. We didn't stick around. Brian kicked the paper aside, and we left. I don't even remember closing the door behind us. We just climbed back up the hill and got in the truck, not really talking. The ride home was dead quiet. A week went by. We didn't talk about the house. I didn't bring it up, and neither did they. Part of me wanted to forget about it, chalk it up to someone messing around and planting that stuff there as a joke. But it didn't sit right. I kept thinking about how clean that paper was. That's the part one couldn't get past. There was no way it had just been sitting there the whole time. Then one day I was cleaning out my truck. I kept it pretty clean, but the back seat had a bunch of junk, hoodies, fast food bags, school folders. I was tossing stuff out when I saw a folded white paper tucked between the seat and the backrest. I pulled it out, thinking it was homework or something, but as soon as I opened it, I knew what it was. The same symbol, same thick black lines, same weird little shapes around the edges. It was the exact same paper we'd seen in the basement. I stared at it for a while before folding it back up and just sitting in the driver's seat with the door open. My stomach felt tight and I started sweating, even though it was cool outside. I didn't want to believe it was the same one, but I knew it was. Later that day, I texted Brian and Eric. Just asked them if they'd brought the paper back. Brian said no, and Eric swore he didn't either. I kept pressing them, and finally Brian said maybe Eric had grabbed it and was messing with me, but Eric swore he hadn't touched it. And I believed him. He wasn't the type to play a long prank, and even if he was, he wouldn't have been able to keep a straight face that long. I didn't sleep great that night. I kept thinking I'd hear someone opening the truck door or sneaking around outside. I even got up at one point and checked the locks on all the doors. The next day, I burned the paper in the fire pit out back. It didn't catch easily. It was like it was thicker than normal paper, but it burned eventually. I didn't go back to that house again. Brian and Eric wanted to a few times after, but I always had some excuse. I didn't want to see what was in that basement again, and I sure as hell didn't want to know who put that paper in my truck. It's been years since all that happened. I've moved twice, finished college, and now I work a regular job in another state. I don't talk to Brian or Eric much anymore. Just the occasional happy birthday text or comment on old Facebook photos. But that house still comes to mind every now and then, usually when I'm driving on back roads or walking into an old building. Sometimes I think maybe one of them did bring the paper back and just won't admit it. Maybe it was all some dumb prank, a way to freak me out. But I've looked at that moment from every angle over the years, and it still doesn't add up. The dust, the locked door, the clean paper, the rose. Who would go through all that for a joke and why? And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it was nothing. But even now, after all this time, I still check the back seat of my truck more often than I need to. Just in case. I grew up in a very small town in Florida. The kind of place where most people know each other, or at least recognize each other's vehicles. One main grocery store, one gas station that everyone used, and a couple of diners that had the same regulars every day. The kind of town where nothing much ever really happened. And for the most part, that was comforting. There was something peaceful about the way everything slowed down at night. After about 9:30 or 10 p.m., you'd hardly see anyone out. Most houses were already dark by then, tucked away in silence under the thick Florida sky. It was especially dark at night because the town didn't really invest in streetlights, except maybe on the main road or around a gas station. Out where I lived, and in many parts of town, the roads were long, narrow, and poorly lit. You'd see patches of yellow glow under some street lamps here and there, but mostly you just had your headlights and maybe the occasional porch light from someone's house way off the road. Dense trees lined the streets in some places, and in others, there were just wide, empty lots or overgrown ditches. During the winter, the population would almost double, or at least that's what it felt like. Snowbirds came down from the north to escape the cold, driving big RVs or pulling trailers behind older trucks. You'd see them parked in yards or lined up along the roadside in that one part of town near the RV park. But they mostly stayed to themselves, and by 10 o'clock at night, even they were usually asleep. When I was 16, I had a boyfriend who lived on the other side of town. He didn't have a license yet, so if we wanted to spend time together, I was usually the one driving over to his place. I'd head over Friday or Saturday nights and hang out for a few hours, watching movies or just talking. It wasn't a far drive, maybe 15 minutes or so, but his neighborhood was noticeably poorer than mine. There were more run-down houses, more beat-up cars parked in yards, and fewer people who seemed to be out after dark. Some of the street signs were missing, and I always double-checked that my doors were locked once I turned into his area. That Saturday night felt pretty normal. I remember it was warmer than usual for winter. The air was heavy and still, the kind of quiet that felt like a blanket over everything. I stayed at his place until about 10, maybe 10:30. I wasn't really paying attention to the time, because it was always the same routine. I'd leave his house, backtrack down a couple side roads, then take the main stretch back toward my parents' neighborhood. As I turned onto the main road that led out of his side of town, I saw a pickup truck coming toward me from the opposite direction. That in itself wasn't strange, but it caught my attention because there weren't usually other cars out that late, especially not in that part of town. The truck passed me going the other way, and I noticed it was kind of beat up looking, an older model, dull red or maroon, maybe with one of those big black grill guards on the front. The windows were dark, so I couldn't see inside, but it just looked like the kind of truck you'd expect an older man to drive. Nothing about it seemed especially strange, until I checked my rearview mirror a minute or so later and noticed that the same truck had turned around. It was following me. At first, I didn't really think much of it. Maybe he lived nearby, maybe he was going to the gas station up the road. There were plenty of reasons for another vehicle to be behind me, even that late at night. I told myself not to be paranoid, but something about the way the truck stayed behind me felt wrong. He wasn't tailgating, but he wasn't far either. The speed was strange. He wasn't matching me exactly, but he was close enough that I could tell he was tracking my route. The road curved and narrowed in places, and his headlights would disappear for a second behind trees, only to reappear again in my rear view, like little twin suns that never blinked. I picked up speed a little, not enough to look suspicious, just enough to feel like I had some space. But the truck sped up too. A strange feeling settled in my stomach, the kind of quiet panic that starts in your chest and spreads out into your arms and legs. I remember my fingers tightening on the steering wheel without me even realizing it, and I started breathing a little faster. I passed a couple of intersections and noticed that the truck didn't turn off at any of them. Still behind me, still slow, still steady. About 5 or 6 minutes into the drive, I decided I didn't want to keep him behind me anymore. Maybe I just needed to pass him and get it over with, just put distance between us. But wait, no, he was behind me. Then at some point, he must have pulled over or done a U-turn to follow me. That part didn't register fully until I was well past the halfway point to my house. The truck had already passed me going the opposite way. Why turn around unless he had a reason? I tried to talk myself down. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he was trying to find an address. Maybe he lived out near my part of town. But as I made another turn, this time onto the longer road that passed through a more rural stretch, he turned too. No hesitation, no blinker, just followed. I felt a jolt of fear then. Not the distant, nervous kind, but real fear. I was still about 6 minutes from my neighborhood, and there were hardly any houses along this stretch of road. Just tall pine trees on both sides, empty lots, the occasional field with rusted-out tractors or barns. No places to pull off, no gas stations, just road and shadows and those headlights that stayed fixed behind me. I reached down and grabbed my phone from the passenger seat. My hands were shaking, and I remember fumbling with the screen, trying to unlock it without looking down too long. I called my dad. I didn't even wait for the ring to end before I put the phone on speaker and laid it on the console. I needed him to know I was on the way and that something wasn't right. By the time I got to the road that led into our neighborhood, I could feel my heart pounding. That part of the drive was usually comforting, lined with houses, familiar yards, old oak trees draped in moss. But that night it felt wrong. Like the darkness was thicker than usual. I slowed down just enough to take the turn, and as I did, I looked in the mirror again. The truck didn't turn in. It had stopped. Just stopped there on the main road, angled slightly like the driver had pulled over to watch. I couldn't see him clearly, but I knew he was in there. I could feel it in the way the headlights stayed on, pointed back toward where I had turned. I didn't know if he could see me from where he was, but I didn't care. I punched the gas and sped down the street toward my parents' house, my knuckles white on the wheel. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw my dad standing there under the porch light. He must have come out as soon as I called. I parked fast, jumped out, and didn't even bother turning off the car at first. I just stood there for a second, staring back at the road, trying to see if the truck had moved. But it hadn't. It was still there, a pair of headlights glowing faintly between the trees. Eventually, my dad walked down the driveway to check. I stayed by the car, breathing hard, trying to calm myself down. He stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, just watching. Then he looked back at me, nodded once, and went back inside. The truck finally drove past a couple minutes later. Not fast, not in a hurry. just eased along the road like it had been waiting for something. My dad told me later that he saw it too. The same dull red truck, older model, windows too dark to see through. He remembered it because it passed by so slowly that it felt deliberate. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept thinking about that look the driver gave me when I passed him earlier, before he started following me. It wasn't just a casual glance. It was the kind of stare that makes you feel exposed, like you're not supposed to be there, like he already decided something before you even had a chance to react. There was something intense about it. Focused. Cold. Nothing ever came of it. I never saw the truck again. We didn't file a report, didn't get a license plate number, and I couldn't describe the man well enough for it to be useful. But the fear stayed with me. That kind of thing sticks, especially when it happens in a place where you've always felt safe. After that night, I stopped driving to my boyfriend's place after dark. We'd meet up during the day or on weekends when someone could give him a ride. I didn't want to be out alone at night anymore. Not in that town, not on those roads. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about instinct. I'd grown up in that town, and I knew the difference between normal and not. And that night, something was very, very off. I still don't know what that man wanted. Maybe he was just bored, or drunk, or looking to scare someone. Or maybe he meant to do something worse and just didn't get the chance. I don't like to think about it too much, but every now and then, when I'm driving home late and the road gets quiet, I remember that red truck, those headlights in my mirror, and that stare that locked onto me like a trap being set. And I remember that I was lucky, really lucky. I was about 7 or 8 years old when this happened. I remember the carpet in our living room had this old pattern that looked like it had been there since before I was born, faded brown and red swirls that never matched anything else in the house. It was late, probably close to midnight, and my sister and I were the only ones awake. She was a couple of years older than me, and I always looked up to her. That night we had decided to stay up late downstairs watching TV, something we weren't usually allowed to do. For some reason, I had dragged my sleeping bag down with me. I don't remember why exactly. I think I just liked being in it. I liked the way the inside felt, warm and tight around me, like it kept everything else out. It made me feel safe. The TV's glow was the only light in the room. I was lying on the carpet in a sleeping bag, and my sister was curled up on the couch under a thin blanket. We had been watching cartoons or some kind of kids movie, but by the end I wasn't even paying attention. I remember my eyes were so heavy I kept blinking just to stay awake. Eventually, we both knew it was time. She turned off the TV, and I stood up with the sleeping bag still around my feet. I remember waddling around in it like a caterpillar trying to turn into a butterfly. We said goodnight, and I walked upstairs carrying the sleeping bag bundled in my arms like a giant pillow. I didn't want to sleep on the floor, though. I want to bring it to bed with me. I like the idea of sleeping inside it on my mattress. Something about that just seemed fun at the time, like a mini adventure. My room was small. A twin bed in the corner, a dresser along one wall, a tiny desk by the window. The carpet was a dull gray blue, and I had a few glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling. I climbed into the sleeping bag on my bed, turned on the little night light I kept near the dresser, and curled up. It didn't take long to drift off. I don't know how long I was asleep when it happened the first time. All I remember is this feeling, this loud thump right next to my face, like someone had slapped the mattress inches from me. It jolted me awake, but it wasn't enough to completely scare me. I just lay there blinking, confused, half asleep. I didn't hear anything else. I didn't see anything. I just assumed it was maybe the sleeping bag shifting or my body twitching in my sleep or something dumb like that. I was too tired to care. I rolled over, closed my eyes, and started to drift off again. But it happened again. This time it wasn't subtle. It was hard, like someone really hit the bed. It came from right beside my face again, like something wanted to wake me up. I bolted upright inside the sleeping bag, my heart going crazy in my chest. My room was still. The night light was still on. I didn't hear anything else, but that second time really got to me. It felt wrong, like something was off. I remember I sat there for a moment trying to figure it out, trying to come up with some kind of reason. I wasn't the kind of kid who jumped at every bump in the night, but this didn't feel like a dream. It felt real. It sounded real. I couldn't stay in that room. I climbed out of the sleeping bag and walked quickly to my sister's room, which was just down the hall. I stood there in the doorway, too nervous to go back, too unsure of what had happened to explain it. I remember feeling small in that moment. The hallway looked so long. The walls had that soft yellowish tint from the lights that came through the kitchen downstairs. I hated the way everything felt too quiet all of a sudden, like the house itself had stopped breathing. I ended up staying in my sister's room. She had a bunk bed, and I climbed into the bottom one. I lay there wide awake for a long time. Every little noise made my body tense. At one point, I thought I heard movement from my room, like something soft shifting across the floor. But I told myself it was just a draft or something falling off a shelf. I didn't want to know. I didn't need to know. I just wanted morning to come. I eventually drifted off again, but it was restless sleep. My dreams were full of strange flashes, faces I didn't recognize, dark corners, places I knew, but that looked wrong somehow. I woke up just as the sky was starting to turn light. My sister was still asleep. Everything was quiet again, but that weird, tight feeling in my chest was still there, like a leftover from the night before. We didn't go back into my room right away. I stayed in hers most of the morning. I remember my parents asking why I didn't sleep in my own bed, but I just said I felt sick or had a bad dream. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't know how to explain it. Eventually, though, we all kind of went about the day like normal. I forgot about it for a few hours. We had cereal in the kitchen, and my sister and I watched TV again while our parents got ready for work. It wasn't until later that something happened again. I had gone back upstairs to grab something, I don't even remember what. And as I got closer to my room, I noticed the door was open wider than I'd left it. I stepped inside and immediately saw that all of my posters had fallen off the walls. Every single one. I had maybe 6 or 7 of them, taped carefully along one wall near the bed. They were just lying there on the carpet, like someone had peeled them all off at once and let them flutter down. That wasn't the only thing. Just outside my room, in the hallway, there had been a few black trash bags we were keeping there until we took them out to the bins. They weren't full of anything heavy, just old clothes and junk we were donating. But they had been standing upright when I went to bed the night before. Now they were all tipped over. It didn't look like they had fallen naturally. They looked like they had been pushed or kicked. My chest got tight again. I stood there in the doorway, staring at everything, not sure what to do. I didn't want to call anyone. I didn't want to explain this either. It felt stupid. It wasn't like a monster jumped out of the closet or something. But everything felt wrong. I knew the way my room looked when I left it. I knew the way those posters were taped up. I knew how the sleeping bag had been left on the bed. Now it was half on the floor like someone had dragged it. I didn't sleep in that room again for days. I moved some of my stuff into my sister's room and stayed there. I made excuses about being scared of the dark or not liking the way the bed felt, but none of that was true. I just didn't feel safe in there anymore. The feeling I had when I woke up that night with the mattress thumping next to my face. That asterisk was real. That wasn't in my head. Something had happened. Something I couldn't explain. For the next week, every time I walked by my room, I'd get this weird chill in my stomach, like I was walking past a place I shouldn't go into. Eventually I did go back because I had to. It was my room, but I never looked at it the same way again. I moved the bed to a different spot. I got rid of the sleeping bag. I stopped putting posters up on that wall. As I got older, I kept trying to come up with explanations. Maybe the posters fell because the tape got loose. Maybe the sleeping bag shifted because I moved in my sleep. Maybe the mattress noise was some kind of muscle twitch or something falling off the bed. Maybe the bags in the hallway were knocked over by the cat. But none of it really made sense together. It wasn't just one thing. It was how everything happened in a row. The noise, the feeling, the mess. The way it felt targeted, like it was aimed at me. And I'll never forget how loud that sound was, that second time. Like a fist slamming into the bed an inch from my face. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that. I still don't. But I believe in moments that feel wrong. Moments that make you question whether the place you call home is always safe. Whatever happened that night wasn't magic or supernatural. It was something physical. Maybe someone had gotten into the house without us realizing. Maybe someone had been hiding, waiting. That thought still makes my skin crawl. I learned something from that week. Not everything scary has to be a monster in the closet or some shadowy figure in the hallway. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones that feel almost explainable, but not quite. Things that happen while everyone else is asleep. Things that leave just enough evidence behind to make you question your own memory. To this day, I can still picture that sleeping bag half hanging off the bed, the posters on the floor like dead leaves, and the garbage bags lying limp in the hall. I can still remember the way the bed felt when it jumped beneath me. I never slept in a sleeping bag on a mattress again after that. And I never again assumed that noises in the night were just in my head. I didn't tell my parents until years later. By then it felt like a strange childhood story more than anything else. But even when I told it, I left parts out. I never talked about the sound being so close to my face. I never said how scared I really was. I think part of me still doesn't want to admit how real it felt. It's funny how a small thing like that can stay with you. How something that only lasted a few minutes can change the way you look at your own bedroom. For a whole week, I avoided that room like it was poisoned. And even now, as an adult, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and listen carefully to the silence, waiting for that sound again, that sharp, deliberate thump. It never came back, but I still remember, and I always will. I was 12 years old when it happened. We lived in a big house back then. Too big, really. My parents had bought it because it was a good deal and they figured it'd be our forever home. It had 5 bedrooms, a big finished basement, and way more space than we ever used. We had whole parts of the house we barely stepped into. Some of the upstairs rooms stayed empty, and the basement was more for storage than anything else. I never liked the basement much, but that's not important here. The kitchen was my favorite spot. It had a large island with a sink built into it, and the whole area felt warm in the afternoons when the sun came in through the windows. That day was a normal school day. I remember it clearly. Every second of it is burned into my head. It was a Friday afternoon in the fall. The air outside was just starting to cool, and the sun was setting earlier every day. The kitchen smelled like lemon cleaner, and the dishwasher had just finished running. It was still warm and humming when I dropped my backpack on one of the stools and sat down to do my homework. I was alone. My mom and dad had gone to the grocery store. They told me they'd be back in an hour or so. At that age, I didn't mind being home alone. I actually liked it. I'd blast music, sneak a soda, maybe take a break from homework, and just sit there staring at nothing. It was my time to be alone, and I liked the quiet. The house had a security system that beeped any time a door or window was opened. It was set up to let us know who was coming and going, and that day, I heard the beep not long after I sat down. The front door was massive, stained dark wood with big heavy metal handles that clanked when you opened it. It swung open hard like someone had shoved it. I heard the familiar tone of the security system. 1 beep for opening, then 2 quick beeps in a row. That was the sound it made when the front door opened. I didn't think much of it. I figured my mom was back. Maybe she forgot something or came home to grab a list. I didn't even lift my head. But then I heard footsteps. Fast ones. At first, it was the sound of shoes pounding against the wooden floor of the foyer. Then the dull thuds as someone turned the corner into the carpeted hallway. They were running, fast, hard, like they knew where they were going. Like they were in a hurry. And they were coming toward the kitchen. I looked up. What I saw didn't even register for a second. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My eyes caught it, but my brain didn't. It was just a shape at first, a shadow in motion. But then the details hit me. There was a man, or someone that looked like one. Average height, maybe a little taller, wearing dark clothes that were dirty, smudged. His face was pale, and his mouth, his mouth, was twisted into the widest grin I'd ever seen. Not a happy smile, not even an angry one. It was like he was smiling for himself, like the grin was just stuck there, stretched tight like a mask. His eyes looked empty, dark around the sockets like he hadn't slept in days. He wasn't just running. He was charging, sprinting right toward me, arms low at his sides, like he was going to tackle me or grab me or worse. I didn't even breathe. My hands froze on the edge of my notebook. My pencil dropped and rolled toward the sink. I should have screamed. I should have bolted or grabbed something or ran. But I didn't. My legs were locked. My chest felt tight, like something was crushing it. I didn't even blink. He was 10 feet away, then 5, at the last possible second. So close I felt the air from him passing by. He turned sharply and darted to the right, down the hallway to my parents' bedroom. Then I heard it, screaming. High-pitched, animal-like screaming that echoed out of the bedroom. The kind of sound that doesn't sound like a person. The kind that makes your spine hurt. It wasn't words. Just raw, horrible noise. There was crashing, too. Things breaking. Loud thuds like furniture being knocked over. The sound of glass shattering, metal clanging, more screams. Long, sharp, then suddenly cut off. I couldn't move. I was still frozen in my chair at the island, eyes fixed on the hallway. And then silence. Everything stopped. The house went still again. Just the low hum of the refrigerator, the quiet ticking of the clock above the stove. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the wetness on my cheeks. I was shaking so badly I thought I was going to fall out of the chair. Then I heard him again. His footsteps were slower now, deliberate. Soft thuds on the carpet as he walked back down the hallway. And then he stepped out. He stood at the end of the hall, not 5 feet away from me. Just stood there, his eyes locked on mine. He wasn't smiling anymore. His mouth was closed, but the shape of the grin was still there, like the muscles in his face had formed it too many times, and it just stayed that way. He stared at me for what felt like forever. I wanted to scream. I wanted to crawl under the island, to hide, to do anything, but I couldn't. It was like I wasn't even in my body anymore. Then, just as quietly as he'd come, he turned and walked out the front door. It didn't slam this time. It just clicked shut. I sat there for a long time. I don't know how long. I didn't even reach for the phone until I heard the sound of the garage door opening. My parents were back. I ran to them the second they walked in and collapsed into my mom's arms. I couldn't even talk. I just sobbed. My dad started shouting, asking what happened, but I couldn't explain it right away. I couldn't put it into words. Eventually I told them. Everything. From the beep to the footsteps to the screaming to the man's face. They didn't think I was making it up. They believed me right away. They could see I wasn't pretending. My hands were still shaking. We went into their room together. The first thing we saw was the broken vase on the floor. One of the heavy ceramic ones that had sat on the dresser for years. The water from the flowers had spilled across the hardwood. There were clothes on the floor that hadn't been there before, and my dad's shaving cream and aftershave were scattered around the bathroom. The glass in the shower had a crack in it, like something had been thrown against it. The sink in the bathroom was still running, full blast. No one ever left it like that. We checked every room, every door, every window. Nothing. No one. He was gone. The security system had logged the door opening, but not closing. My dad said that meant the guy left before the system could register the door shut again, or that he shut it so quietly the sensor didn't register it. Either way, he was gone. The police were called, of course. They came, took a report, dusted for prints. There were some partials on the inside handle of the front door that didn't match ours, and a smudge on the hallway wall at chest height, like someone had braced their hand against it as they turned. They took it seriously, but no one was ever caught. They thought maybe it was a break-in, maybe someone on drugs, maybe a mental health episode. We didn't know him. He wasn't a neighbor. We asked around, and no one had seen anything. No one had a security camera pointing toward our house, either. Nothing came of it. After that, I refused to stay home alone. At first my parents thought I'd grow out of it, but I didn't. I get sick to my stomach if they even talked about going out without me. I missed sleepovers, birthday parties, all kinds of normal stuff because I couldn't stand being in the house by myself. If I had to come home from school and they weren't back yet, I'd sit on the front steps and wait until I saw the car. I didn't care if it was raining. I didn't care if it was cold. I wasn't going in. They added more locks, got a camera doorbell, replaced the front door sensor. They did everything they could, but I never felt safe there again. The house felt different after that day. It was like something had been let in. Not a ghost or spirit or anything like that. Just the memory of what had happened. The knowledge that someone had walked in, sprinted past me, screamed in the next room, then walked away smiling. That kind of thing doesn't leave a place easily. Years later, after I'd moved out, I went back to visit once. Just for a holiday. The house was the same, mostly. My parents still lived there, though they'd turned my old room into a guest room and changed some of the furniture. But when I walked past the kitchen, past the island where I'd been sitting that day, I felt it all again like it had just happened. I stood there for a long time, staring down the hallway toward their bedroom. They sold the house a couple years after that, moved into a smaller place. 1 floor, fewer rooms, no unused space. No more long hallways. No more giant wooden doors. I never told anyone outside the family what happened. Not in full. It wasn't something I wanted to relive, and most people don't know how to respond to something like that anyway. They either brush it off or try to make it about them. But I remember it. Every sound, every detail of his face, every second I sat there, frozen, helpless. It was real, and I've never stayed home alone again. Not once. Not even now. It was one of those nothing special weekends. The kind that sort of drifts by while you're half bored and half content doing the same stuff you've done 100 times already. Me, Mike, Haley, and Lois were all hanging out like we usually did. No plans, no goals, just a group of friends wasting time together. We were in 7-Eleven, sitting on the curb out front, chewing on salty pretzels and sipping soda straight from the bottle. We've been talking about dumb things, school, people we didn't like, stuff like that. The weather was a little cool, not cold enough for a jacket, just enough to make you blow into your hands every now and then. I was scrolling on my phone, not really paying attention to anything, when a notification popped up, a text from Melanie. I hadn't talked to her in a while. The message was short, but weird enough to snap me out of my lazy haze. So me and Jill found this creepy abandoned house, and we want to go in. I still have that text saved. It felt like something out of a bad teen horror movie. I showed it to the group. Mike laughed, said it was stupid. Haley and Lois weren't so sure. At first they said no, just shrugged it off, but Melanie kept texting, and eventually, after a bit of back and forth and convincing, we gave in. I think part of it was boredom. Another part was maybe just wanting to do something we'd remember later. Something to break up the monotony. So, just like that, our lazy night turned into a half-serious urban exploration. We met up with Melanie and Jill a few blocks away from the house. I don't know why, but it already felt off just standing there with them. Melanie was excited, jittery, like she was about to get on a roller coaster. Jill was quiet. She had this look in her eyes that didn't match the situation. It wasn't nervousness. It was like she was thinking hard about something, but not saying it. There were 7 of us total, but really, not everyone mattered. Some just tagged along for the hell of it, said a few things, then disappeared into the background. I didn't even catch all their names. What mattered is what happened later, and it mostly comes down to me, Jill, and the house. The walkover took maybe 15 minutes. The streets were quiet, the kind of suburban silence that settles in after 10 p.m. No cars, just porch lights glowing over neatly trimmed lawns, a couple dogs barking somewhere in the distance, and the sound of our footsteps. I remember passing a small park and thinking about how often I walked by it in daylight, never really giving a second thought. But everything looks different at night. We reached the house just before 11 o'clock. It was exactly what you'd expect a creepy house to look like. 2 stories, old with siding grayed and warped with time, boards nailed haphazardly over the windows. The lawn was dead, just dirt and patches of dry grass. We circled around to the backyard. The gate was already open. That should have been the first red flag, but we didn't care. The backyard was this narrow little rectangle, barely enough room for a few steps between the back door and the pool in the middle. The pool was covered with one of those thick, dark blue safety covers, stretched tight across the surface and held in place with metal hooks. The area around it was cracked concrete. Weeds pushed up between the lines. The lock on the back door was one of those old ones that looked tougher than it really was. Someone had a small pry bar, and with a little effort, we popped it open. I don't remember who had the tool. Could have been Mike, could have been Jill. Either way, the door creaked open, and just like that, we were inside. The house was cold and smelled like wet wooden mold. There was no furniture, just outlines in the dust where things used to be. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the floor creaked under every step. We moved in slowly, flashlights out. Most people had one on their phone. It wasn't pitch black. Some light from the street seeped in through cracks and holes, but it was dim enough to make everything feel closer and heavier. At first, it was just typical abandoned house stuff. A broken sink in the kitchen, an old rotary phone mounted to the wall, cracked tiles. We split up. That's always how it happens. Someone sees a hallway and wanders off. Someone else calls dibs on exploring the basement. It's not like we made a plan or stuck together. We just drifted exploring. I ended up upstairs with Jill. I don't even remember deciding to go with her. It was like we just moved in the same direction at the same time. The staircase was narrow and steep, covered in dust. Every step sounded like it could give way, but it held. At the top, we turned right. The first door on that side was closed. I reached for the handle, but before I could even touch it, Jill backed away. She didn't say anything, just stared at the door like something was behind it. Her breathing changed, shallow, fast. I didn't know what to make of it. I pushed the door open. The room was small, bare walls. But what made it strange was that the walls were covered with mirrors. All of them cracked. Some had fallen and shattered on the floor. The glass shards glinted in the light, and they weren't clean. Some of them had this dried brown-red stuff smeared across them. It didn't take much imagination to guess what it could be. Right in the middle of the room was a single chair. Just a plain wooden chair, nothing fancy, but it was facing the far wall away from the door. The mirrors reflected us from every angle, like we were standing in a fun house someone had taken a hammer to. Jill stepped in slowly, almost like she wasn't scared anymore. Her panic had melted away into something else. Curiosity, maybe, or something worse. She said she wanted to check out the attic. There was a string hanging from the ceiling just outside the room, the kind that pulls down a folding staircase. I reached up and pulled it. The staircase creaked as it unfolded. The air from above was dry and smelled like old paper. We climbed up. You couldn't stand in the attic. You had to crawl. The ceiling angled down hard like a tent. Jill went in first, flashlight in one hand, the other pushing along the wood beams for support. There were boxes, books, piles of old magazines. Nothing special. I stayed just at the top of the staircase, kneeling half in and half out. Then we heard the noise. It was a low, deep growl, the kind that doesn't belong in a house. Not the sound of wind or an animal. It came from just ahead of Jill in the shadows. I froze. I looked up and saw something. I don't know if it was real or if my brain filled in the blanks with fear, but I swear I saw a girl. Her skin looked pale, almost gray in the light, and her hair was long, black, hanging over her face. She wasn't moving, just laying there, growling. Her arms were stiff, twisted like she had fallen or been broken. Jill screamed and crawled backward so fast she lost her balance. She fell through the attic opening, and somehow her weight hit the folding staircase just right to make it snap up and close. I was stuck. I started yelling, but no one answered. The attic was dark again, and that thing, or whatever it was, started moving, crawling. I could hear it dragging itself, slow but steady. I lost it. I pulled the multi-tool out of my hoodie pocket and started slamming it against the latch, the hinges, anything. I just wanted out. My hand was shaking so hard I almost dropped it. The noise kept getting closer. Closer. I could feel it. Not see it, but feel it like something cold right behind me. Then something touched me. Just the lightest brush on my back, but it was enough. I slammed the tool down, so hard it bent. Something in the latch gave. The staircase dropped open, and I fell straight through. I landed bad. My wrist snapped at the wrong angle. Pain shot my arm. I laid there on the hallway floor, staring up at the attic hole. Nothing came out. It was just dark and silent again. Jill was gone. I don't mean gone like she left the house. I mean she didn't come help. Didn't open the attic again. Didn't say a word. I stumbled down the stairs, holding my arm. The others were already outside, talking, laughing nervously like it had all been a game. No one believed me, or they didn't care. Jill said she panicked and ran out. Said she thought I was right behind her. She didn't mention the attic or the girl or anything. I went to urgent care the next morning. Fractured wrist. Had to wear a brace for 6 weeks. My mom asked how it happened. I said I slipped on some steps. She didn't press. I didn't see much of that group after. Everyone just sort of drifted away, like the whole thing was some weird dream no one wanted to remember. I unfollowed Jill from everything. I don't care if it was fear or instinct or just her being selfish, but she left me in that attic. She knew I was still up there. She didn't even try. As for the girl, the one I think I saw, I don't have an explanation. Maybe it was some old squatter who died up there. Maybe it was a trick of the shadows, my brain firing wrong from panic. Maybe there was nothing there at all, and I imagined it. But I know what I heard, and I know something touched me. Whatever it was, I haven't been in a house like that since. Haven't done any more urban exploring. Sometimes I wake up at night and hear that same dragging noise. Just for a second. Just long enough to make me sit up in bed, heart pounding. But there's never anything there. I don't need there to be. That night was enough. I've been in pain. Real pain. I've had broken bones, panic attacks, trust shattered like glass on the floor. And no one will ever convince me it was just in my head. It had been a long, draining day. School always felt like a mental marathon. Lectures that dragged on too long, crowded hallways, and group projects where I ended up doing most of the work. I got home sometime after 5, completely worn out mentally and physically. My bag hit the floor before I even took off my shoes, and I remember thinking I'd just lie down on the couch for a few minutes. Just enough to reset, I told myself. I never made it to my bed. I didn't bother changing out of my clothes. I didn't brush my teeth or wash my face. I just collapsed face first into the worn fabric of the couch, my body folding into the cushions like I'd been pulled down by gravity itself. My phone was still in my hand, screen still lit up, half scrolling through some video someone had sent me. I didn't even have the energy to plug it in. The screen dimmed on its own, fading into black as my eyes closed. The house was dark. I had turned off most of the lights earlier to save electricity. Only the kitchen night light, that soft orange glow, spilled faintly across the tile floor and barely touched the edge of the living room. That and the dim green light from the microwave clock were the only sources of light left. Outside, I could hear the soft hum of the streetlight that flickered every few seconds. My neighborhood was usually quiet, especially at night. A few barking dogs, the occasional passing car. Nothing that ever really got my attention. I must have fallen asleep around 8:30 or 9 o'clock. When I drifted off, I felt the kind of exhaustion that makes your limbs feel heavy, like your muscles are made of lead. I was only half aware of slipping into sleep, but the silence and darkness helped me disappear into it quickly. The last thing I remember before going out was my phone, still resting loosely in my fingers. Hours passed. I don't know how long exactly, but when I opened my eyes again, everything felt off. It wasn't the dreamlike haze you usually feel when waking up. It was sharper, more abrupt, like my brain had been shocked back into awareness. Something had pulled me out of sleep fast. That kind of middle-of-the-night alertness that only comes when something's wrong. My phone buzzed violently in my hand. The vibration startled me more than the sound did. It was just a message alert, the same one I always had, but in the dead silence of the living room. It might as well have been a fire alarm. The buzz stopped, and then the screen lit up, glowing in the otherwise dark room. The bright light was disorienting for a second, and I blinked, adjusting. I could see that it was a text from my sister. I didn't open it right away. I was too focused on something else. There was someone standing in front of me. At first, I didn't believe it. My brain tried to rationalize it. It had to be a dream, a trick of the light, maybe even the reflection from the TV screen or a shadow cast by something outside. But it wasn't. My vision was clear enough. My senses were awake. There was a man in my house. He was maybe 6 feet away, not moving, just standing there, facing away from me. I could see the outline of his shoulders, his back slightly hunched forward. He was tall, taller than me, with broad shoulders and short-cropped dark hair. I couldn't see his face, but I could see his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He wasn't holding anything that I could tell, but I wasn't about to move to find out. I froze. My body stiffened like it had locked up. For a second I thought maybe he hadn't noticed me. I was lying on my side, halfway buried in the couch cushions, my phone dimming again in my hand. I didn't dare move. I thought about screaming. I thought about jumping up and running for the door. But my body wouldn't move. My instinct took over and told me to stay still. Then my phone buzzed again, and that's when he froze. He hadn't moved at all until that moment. But the second that vibration cut through the silence, he stopped breathing, or it looked like he did. His whole body stiffened like he'd been caught. Then, slowly, he began to turn. I wanted to close my eyes completely. I wanted to pretend I was still asleep. But something in me needed to see. I kept my eyes mostly closed, just enough of a slit to make out what was happening. He turned all the way around. His face came into view. It was blank. No mask. No emotion. Just an ordinary-looking man. Mid-30s maybe. Pale skin, dark eyes, a narrow jaw. He looked like he could have been anyone. Not a monster, not someone you'd expect to see on a wanted poster. That made it worse. He stared at me, silent. Still, he didn't say a word. I could feel my heart beating in my throat, pumping so hard I was sure he'd hear it. My breaths were shallow, controlled, like I was trying not to breathe at all. He stood like that for what felt like forever. 10 seconds? 30? I don't know. It felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, he began to move again. Slowly, carefully. His footsteps were silent. He walked toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen. I could hear the soft click of the back door unlocking. Then it opened, just wide enough for him to step through. He slipped outside and shut the door behind him. Not slammed, not pulled hard, just gently closed it. I didn't move at first. I couldn't. I laid there frozen, paralyzed by what I had just seen. I kept waiting to hear the door open again, or to hear footsteps coming back through the kitchen. But nothing happened. Just silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. When I finally convinced myself he was gone, I jumped up, almost tripping over myself in the process. My legs were weak. I felt sick. I ran to the back door, locked it, then pulled every curtain in the house shut. I locked the front door, the windows, even the door to the garage. I flipped on every light I could find. The quiet was unbearable. Every creak in the house made me whip my head around. Every flicker of a light made me jump. I sat back down on the couch, phone still in my hand, shaking now. My sister's message was still there. Just a dumb meme she'd sent, probably out of boredom. Something harmless. Something normal. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to do. Calling the police felt strange. I couldn't explain it. What was I supposed to say? There was a guy standing in my living room, and then he left. I had no proof. No forced entry. Nothing stolen. Just a man who came in, stood over me, and left. It sounded insane, even to me, but I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I stayed awake, gripping a knife I kept hidden in the couch. Just a small folding knife I'd bought on a whim months earlier and forgotten about until that moment. I held it so tight my knuckles ached. Every noise made me flinch. I sat there until the sun started to come up. In the daylight, everything felt different. Less scary, more surreal. Like maybe I'd dreamed it all, but I hadn't. I remembered every detail. The way his shirt was wrinkled, the faint scent of sweat and dirt when he passed, the sound of the back door closing. None of it faded. It burned into my memory like a scar. I checked every door and window again in the morning. All locked. No signs of damage. But I did notice something out of place. A smudge on the inside of the back door's glass. A fingerprint. Not mine. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it. I still didn't call the police. And I still can't tell you why. Maybe it felt pointless. Maybe I didn't want to relive it by talking to someone. Maybe I was scared of how ridiculous it would sound. I just cleaned the glass, locked the door again, and went about my day like nothing had happened. But it changed something in me. I don't fall asleep on the couch anymore. I don't leave my doors unlocked, even when I'm home. I installed a deadbolt the very next day and a cheap security camera above the back door. I check it every night. I check in the morning. I keep a heavier knife in the drawer now and one by my bed. I even put bars on the windows, something I used to think only paranoid people did. But I guess that's what I am now. Paranoid. Because whoever he was, he didn't take anything. He didn't try to hurt me. He didn't say a word. He just watched me, stared at me while I pretended to sleep. That's what eats at me. That silence. That stillness. Like he was studying me. Like he wasn't there to steal. He was there to see how close he could get. I think about that night more than I care to admit. Not every day, but often enough. It always comes back in flashes when I'm trying to fall asleep or when I wake up to a strange sound. That moment when my phone buzzed and he turned his head. I see it every time I close my eyes in the dark. I should have called the police. I know that now. Maybe they wouldn't have believed me. Maybe they couldn't have done anything. But still, I should have called. If not for me, then for the next person. Because if a man like that is comfortable walking into a stranger's home and watching them sleep, then I doubt I was his first. And I'm scared I won't be his last. I remember that summer visit like it just happened last night, even though it's been a few years. My dad lives way up in Minnesota, deep in the woods where the air smells like pine and the roads feel like they go on forever. It's the kind of place that's quiet in a way that makes your ears ring. He has this small single-story house just past a gravel road, surrounded by tall trees that block out most of the light even during the day. Nights out, there are pitch black. No street lights, no neighbors close by. Just a small porch light, crickets, and the occasional rustle of some animal in the trees. That summer I was staying for a few weeks. I hadn't seen my dad in a while, and we thought it'd be good to catch up. The house was simple, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a cramped bathroom, and a guest room for me. The guest room had old carpeting, a queen-size bed with a heavy quilt, a wooden nightstand, and a closet without a door. Inside the closet, for some reason, there was a full-length mirror leaning against the back wall. It wasn't nailed down, just standing there a slight tilt. The mirror faced directly outwards, which meant when I lay on the bed, I could see my own reflection in the dark if the light caught it right. I never liked that mirror. There's something about mirrors at night that just makes me uneasy. The walls in the house were paper thin. You could hear the TV from the living room clear as day, even with your door shut, or the sound of someone walking around, opening a drawer, anything. That's how it was. The kind of quiet where the tiniest sound stands out. My dad's bedroom was down the hall, around the corner, and he always kept his door closed at night. He snored like a freight train, so I was pretty sure I'd know if he got up to use the bathroom or something. This one night, everything was normal. We'd grilled burgers for dinner, watched some late-night game show reruns, and then called it a night around 11. I brushed my teeth, got into bed, and tried to drift off. It was warm that night, even with the fan on, and I kept tossing and turning. I remember looking at my iPod. It was one of those old iPod Touch models, and the time read 2:54 a.m. I hadn't even realized it was that late. The battery was low, just 4%, but I still thought maybe a song or two would help me fall asleep. Problem was my charger was in my backpack, about 3 feet away from the bed, and I didn't feel like getting up to get it. I figured I'd just deal with it and fall asleep bored. So I rolled over, facing the wall, and closed my eyes. That's when I heard it, the doorknob. It started rattling, not just once or twice, but rapidly, like someone was twisting it back and forth, like they were trying to open it quickly. It was loud, too loud. It didn't sound like someone being quiet about it. My eyes shot open, and I immediately turned around in bed to look. The knob stopped, and then the door slowly creaked open. Just a few inches, but enough for me to see the hallway light spill into the dark room. My heart was pounding in my chest. At first, I thought maybe it was my older brother. He used to screw with me when we were younger, trying to scare me in the middle of the night. But he wasn't visiting. He was back in Florida with Mom. So unless my dad suddenly developed a sense of humor, it didn't make sense. I kept staring at the door. It didn't move again. Nothing came in. Just that soft yellow light outlining the edge of the doorframe. I told myself it must have been air conditioning, or maybe the latch just wasn't shut all the way. I turned back around and pulled the covers over my shoulder. That's when I heard footsteps. They were heavy, slow, not like bare feet, but like boots or shoes thumping softly on the carpet. I heard them come from the door, cross right past the foot of the bed, and stop in the middle of the room, just behind me. I didn't breathe. I kept my eyes closed, afraid to even blink. My brain was screaming that someone was in the room. I could feel it. You know that feeling you get when someone's staring at you? That pressure on the back of your neck? That's what I felt. My body was completely still under the covers. I was sweating. Every inch of my back was tense. Minutes passed. I don't know how many. I just lay there, listening, hoping it was in my head. Eventually, I had to open my eyes. I needed to see. So slowly, carefully, I moved the blanket down from my face. The room looked the same. The door was still cracked, open a few inches. The hallway was still dimly lit, but that pressure was still there. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Then, for whatever reason, I turned my head slightly to the right and looked into the closet mirror. And that's when I saw him. There was a silhouette of a large man standing right next to my bed, on the side I was facing. He was crouched forward, upper body leaned toward me, as if examining me. His right arm was extended, almost touching the edge of the bed, just a few inches from my face. He wasn't moving, just standing there, frozen in place, like he'd been watching me the entire time. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat just locked up. I froze. I instinctively patted around the bed, trying to find my phone. My fingers brushed over it, and I must have hit the play button by accident. Suddenly, music blasted in the silence. Taylor Swift's Love Story. It echoed in the room like a gunshot. My eyes shot back to the mirror. He was gone. Nothing. The space next to my bed was empty. The pressure lifted. The weight that had been sitting on my chest vanished like it had never been there. I didn't move. I just lay there, too afraid to get out of bed or even turn off the music. So I let play, over and over again. I looped that song all night, buried under the blanket, watching that mirror until the sun came up and light finally filled the room. When I got up the next morning, the door was still cracked the same way. No footprints. No signs anyone had been in the room. I checked with my dad. He said he hadn't left his room all night. I believed him. I never saw that man again. I never heard footsteps again. But every night for the rest of that trip, I kept the hallway light on. I pointed the mirror toward the wall. I charged my iPod before bed. And I never, ever slept with my back to the room again. I still don't know what really happened that night. Maybe it was sleep paralysis. Maybe it was a dream that felt too real. Maybe my mind filled in the blanks in the dark, and I imagined the whole thing. But I swear on everything, what I saw in that mirror wasn't a dream. It wasn't a ghost either. It was a man, and I don't know how he got in, and I don't know why he left. I was young when this happened. Not little enough that I can excuse it as a child's mistake, though I've tried to tell myself it a few times. I was old enough to know better, but maybe not wise enough to care. I like to say it was just a stupid decision made by a kid too excited to think straight, but truthfully, I might have just been stupid. I had just gotten a new bike. It was one of those matte black ones with the thick tires and silver detailing that made it look like it could survive a war. It was beautiful to me. I wanted one for a long time, and when I finally got it, I couldn't stop looking at it. I'd walk into the garage just to stare at it, touching the grips on the handlebars or spinning the front tire. It was mine, and it looked fast even when it wasn't moving. The rule was clear. I wasn't allowed to leave our street. Not even just the neighborhood, the actual street we lived on. Our block was part of a bigger neighborhood that wound around in looping cul-de-sacs and curved side roads. My parents had made the rules simple, so there wouldn't be any confusion. I could ride in front of our house, go up and down the sidewalks, even turn around at the cul-de-sac at the end. But that was it. Of course, as soon as they weren't looking, I broke that rule. I didn't even hesitate. It wasn't defiance, not really. It was more like I didn't see why I had to listen. I was confident, the kind of confidence that doesn't come from experience, but from having never failed at anything truly dangerous. I figured I'd be careful. I'd be quick. I'd just take the bike around a few other blocks, maybe find a cool hill to race down. I told myself I'd be back before they even noticed I was gone. So I set out. I remember the way the breeze hit me as I picked up speed. It was warm out, summer warm, where the pavement had a slight shimmer to it, and the air smelled like cut grass and someone's sprinkler mist. I pedaled fast, more for the thrill than anything else. I was breathing a little hard already, not because I was out of shape, but because I was excited, like I was doing something important or adventurous. The neighborhood I went into wasn't far. Just a few blocks over, past a stop sign, and then a sharp right down a street I didn't know the name of. The houses all looked kind of similar. Same beige siding, same two-car garages, same American flags or hanging plants on the porches. Still, it felt new to me, unfamiliar. I cruised down the sidewalk, dodging trash cans that hadn't been pulled in yet, and watching my shadow stretch out long in front of me. I wasn't paying much attention to anything else. Not the parked cars. Not the occasional sound of a lawnmower starting up in the distance. Not even the occasional bird that flapped away as I zoomed by. I was in my own little world, enjoying the speed, the feel of rubber against concrete, the freedom of doing something I wasn't supposed to do. Then I heard the van. It was a low rumble behind me at first, then the slow creak of tires rolling over asphalt. I glanced over my shoulder, more out of habit than concern, and saw it creeping behind me on the road. It was one of those older vans, the kind without any windows on the back. It was dark green, maybe blue, hard to tell in the light, and the front grille looked a little crooked. It was the kind of van you'd expect to see loaded with tools or maybe hauling furniture. But it was empty in the back. No signs or logos. No license plate that I could see from my angle. I slowed down a little. Just a little. Not enough to stop, but enough to let him pass if he wanted to. But he didn't pass. He stayed behind me. Not tailgating, just following at an oddly slow pace. I picked up speed again. I told myself maybe he lived here. Maybe he was just being cautious. But something felt wrong. You know when you get that crawling feeling at the back of your neck, like your skin knows before your brain does? That's what it felt like. That slow, creeping tension that doesn't go away no matter how you shift or move. I glanced back again. The van was still behind me, and now it was a little closer. I tried to ignore it. I kept pedaling. I made a right turn at the next intersection, trying to act casual. I figured maybe he'd keep going straight or turn somewhere else. But the van turned with me. Now, my heart started pounding. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to panic, didn't want to make a scene. Maybe it was nothing. But the fact that I'd gone where I wasn't supposed to go made everything worse. I knew I couldn't go to my house, not straight there. I didn't want him knowing where I lived. I turned again, then again, trying to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Each time, the van followed. I stopped pretending it was nothing. I sped up, pushing the pedals hard. My legs were starting to ache, but adrenaline took over. I glanced back and saw the van still turning with me, matching my movements like it had all the time in the world. I bolted. I raced toward the end of the street, knowing I'd have to cross the busy road to get anywhere near home. It was one of those 4-lane streets with a wide median in the middle and constant traffic, especially in the afternoons. I knew I wasn't supposed to cross it on my own, but I didn't have a choice now. I didn't even look before I shot across. A car honked, tires squealed, and I felt the rush of air and the scream of brakes as I narrowly missed getting hit. The world spun a little from the adrenaline and fear, but I kept going. I didn't stop to breathe or check my surroundings. I pedaled down the back street behind my own, the one that paralleled mine but didn't connect directly to it. My mind was running wild. I was trying to think of where to go, what to do. I didn't want him to see me go home, didn't want to lead him straight there. But I needed to get off the street. I needed cover. That's when I remembered the neighbors who lived directly behind us. They had a big yard and a short chain-link fence. If I ditched the bike in their yard, I could climb over their fence, reach over mine, and drop into our backyard. From there, I could get inside without being seen from the street. So that's what I did. I turned sharply into their driveway, which was empty, and rolled the bike onto the grass in the backyard. I didn't even bother laying it down gently. I let it crash against the ground and ran for the fence. It wasn't hard to climb. I'd done it before during games of tag or hide and seek. I hoisted myself up, the metal digging into my palms, then leaned forward and grabbed the top of my own fence. Our fence was taller, made of thick wood slats with narrow gaps between them. I hooked my arms over the top, pulled myself up, and managed to balance just long enough to drop down into my backyard. I hit the ground harder than I expected. My knees buckled, and I scraped my elbow on the grass where it met the edge of the patio. But I didn't stop moving. I scrambled to my feet and ducked behind our grill, heart pounding so hard it hurt. I stayed there, crouched in the backyard, trying to control my breathing. I listened hard, trying to hear if the van had followed me onto the street. It was quiet for a minute, then I heard it. The low hum of an engine. I crept forward and peeked through one of the narrow holes in the wooden slats. The van was there, rolling slowly down the street that ran behind ours. It moved like it was hunting, looking. Then it stopped, right in front of the house, behind us, the one where I'd left my bike. I watched through the hole as the driver sat there for a while. He didn't get out. He didn't honk or open the door. Just sat there, engine idling, looking at the yard, looking at my bike. He must have thought it was my house. Or maybe he wasn't sure. Either way, he waited. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I was too scared. Eventually, after what felt like forever, he pulled away. No hurry. Just eased the van forward and disappeared down the street. I didn't come out from behind the grill for a long time. I couldn't. My legs felt weak and my mouth was dry, and I couldn't stop shaking. When I finally stood up, I stayed in the yard. I didn't dare go out front. I just sat on the steps until the sun was lower in the sky and the shadows stretched long. I didn't tell my parents. I should have. I know that now. But at the time, all I could think about was how mad they'd be that I went off the street, that I crossed the busy road, that I almost got hit, that I broke the rules, The neighbor brought my bike back the next day. He found it lying in his yard and assumed I must have left it there by accident. I said nothing. I just nodded and thanked him and wheeled it back into the garage. I didn't ride it again for a long time. Weeks, maybe months. Even now, I think about that van sometimes. I wonder who that man was, what he wanted, what might have happened if I'd hesitated, if I'd gone straight home instead of ducking through the yard, if I hadn't been able to reach the top of that fence, if I'd frozen in the street when a car almost hit me. I'll never know. And honestly, I don't want to. Some people think nothing would have happened, that it was just a weird guy being too persistent. Maybe, but the look of that van, the way it followed, the way it stopped and stared at the bike, no part of it felt normal. Looking back, I know I made a lot of mistakes. I broke the rules. I went off the street. I took risks I didn't need to take. But for all that, I got away. I got lucky. It could have ended differently. It didn't. And I never told anyone. Not because I didn't want to, because I was ashamed. Because part of me still thinks maybe it was all my fault. But I know this. I never rode past my street again. Not once. Not even when I was older. Not even when I could. That line stayed burned in my head. A boundary I never crossed again. And even now, when I hear the low rumble of a van behind me, my stomach tightens and I glance over my shoulder just to be sure. I was 13 when it happened, and even though more than a decade has passed, I can still remember the way the light filtered through the trees that afternoon, the way the air smelled like damp pine and mud, and the weightless feeling of free fall before I hit the water. I can remember the cold panic that gripped my chest, not from the chill of the stream, but from the split-second realization that I couldn't move. I was stuck, trapped beneath the surface of a swimming hole I thought I knew like the back of my hand. My grandparents owned a house on a wooded peninsula in the Carolinas. The land jutted out into a wide, still body of water that fed into one of the larger lakes in the region. It was heavily forested, the trees thick and green during the warmer months, and the undergrowth just wild enough to make exploring feel like an adventure, even though I wasn't really far from the house most of the time. That house was a vacation home of sorts. My grandparents lived in Florida for half the year, and during the months they were away, my aunts and uncles and parents used it as a kind of shared retreat. Because of that setup, there was never really a routine there. It always felt in between, like the kind of place where time stretched and sagged, loose around the edges. When we visited, we stayed for a few weeks at a time, and the days bled together in a slow mix of bike rides, fishing, reading on the back porch, and wandering through the woods like we were the only people alive in the world. For a kid like me, someone who wasn't used to a lot of supervision to begin with, it felt like freedom. Real freedom. The kind you dream about when you're sitting in a classroom in February watching snow fall out the window and wishing summer would hurry up and get there already. The house itself was modest, 2 stories, old, with wood siding painted a soft gray blue that had faded in patches from years of sun exposure. It had a screened porch on the backside that overlooked the water, and you could hear the frogs at night, the water lapping softly against the shore just beyond the lawn. Inside, it smelled like cedar and salt and old paperbacks. Every room had mismatched furniture, the kind that had been moved around too many times, and there were always blankets draped over the backs of chairs and old magazines stacked on the coffee tables. I love that house. I still do. But what I really loved back then was the land around it, especially the swimming holes. The woods behind the house were crisscrossed with a series of streams that eventually fed out into the lake. They weren't deep or fast-moving, but in certain places the water pooled wide and slow, forming what we called holes. Some were only waist deep. Others were deeper, dark and cold at the bottom, even in the middle of summer, where the current had carved a little bowl out of the mud and rock over time. These places were magic to me. That's the only word I have for it. Magic. Not in any mystical way, but in the sense that I felt completely at home there. I'd wade through the woods barefoot, with mosquito bites on my legs and twigs in my hair, swinging a towel over my shoulder and carrying a pair of goggles in my hand. Sometimes I'd spend hours out there, swimming or climbing trees, or just sitting in the shade listening to the water move over rocks. My favorite spot was a hole about a 15-minute walk from the house. past a collapsed wooden footbridge, and through a narrow trail that twisted between the trees and dropped steeply toward a bend in the stream. It wasn't easy to get to, which was probably part of the reason I liked it. It felt like mine. The pool there was bigger than most, maybe 15 feet across, and deep enough that you couldn't touch the bottom unless you swam straight down. The water was murky past the first few feet. Not dirty exactly, but filled with tiny particles of silt and algae that made everything cloudy the moment you dipped beneath the surface. If you went down too far, the light disappeared fast, and it felt like you were swimming into a greenish-black void. There was a thick rope tied to a branch on one of the bigger trees near the edge, worn smooth from years of use. Somebody, probably one of my older cousins, had rigged it years ago, and it had become a fixture of the place. You could swing out over the water and drop from 10 or 12 feet up if you timed it right. I'd done it 100 times by the summer I turned 13. That particular day, my parents were taking a nap inside after lunch. It was hot, the air sticky with humidity and thick with the drone of cicadas. I was restless, bored. I remember pacing around the porch for a while, trying to decide what to do with myself. My older brother wasn't around. He'd gone fishing with my uncle, and the idea of sitting in front of the TV felt like a waste. I wanted to move. I wanted to be in the water. So I grabbed my towel and goggles, slipped on my trunks, and headed out without telling anyone. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd done it before. We all had. It wasn't like it was far. I knew the trail like the back of my hand. It took maybe 10 minutes to get there that day. The heat made everything feel slower. I remember the way the sun filtered through the trees, casting long, wavering shadows on the dirt. I swatted at gnats as I walked, my feet sliding on the dry leaves and pine needles that carpeted the ground. When I reached the hole, I tossed my towel onto a flat rock near the edge and walked straight to the rope. There was no hesitation, no pause to test the water or check the depth. I'd done this so many times it felt like muscle memory. I grabbed a rope, pulled it back as far as I could, and ran. My feet kicked up dust as I sprinted toward the edge, and for a second I was flying, arms stretched, rope taut, legs dangling over the water before I let go and dropped. The splash was loud, a satisfying smack that echoed against the banks. The shock of cold water hit me like it always did, startling but good. I kicked hard, letting the momentum carry me downward. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I just wanted to see if I could reach the bottom. I liked the challenge of it, liked testing myself. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The light disappeared quickly, swallowed by the murk. I squinted, looking for the bottom, and when I saw the vague outline of something solid, mud, maybe a log, I reached for it, brushing my fingertips against it before planting my feet and pushing off hard. But I didn't go anywhere. At first, I thought I hadn't kicked off hard enough. So I tried again. Same result. I felt the pressure of the water around me, the resistance, but I didn't rise. My legs moved, my arms moved, but it was like something was holding me in place. That's when I realized I couldn't move my lower body. Not really. My arms were free, but my waist wasn't. I twisted, trying to turn, and felt the unmistakable tug of fabric snagged on something. I didn't have time to think clearly. Panic came in fast, sharp and cold. I yanked at the waistband of my trunks, but they were caught tight. I reached down blindly, trying to feel what had grabbed me. My hand brushed against something rough and solid. Would I think? A jagged edge, a broken stump, maybe. I couldn't see anything. The water was too dark, but I knew I was stuck, really stuck. I thrashed, hard. My legs kicked, my arms flailed, but I barely moved. The more I struggled, the tighter the grip seemed. My lungs started to burn. It was like they'd filled with fire. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, the air pressing against the inside of my rib cage, begging to be let out. I clenched my jaw, shaking with effort. That's when the darkness started creeping in. First at the edges of my vision, little black curtains slowly closing. Then the bright flashes of light, pinpricks like fireflies behind my eyes. My limbs got heavy, so heavy. My arms slowed down, my legs stopped kicking. I wasn't thinking anymore, just fading. I could feel my body giving up. It wasn't like falling asleep. It was worse, more final. And then something moved, a shape, maybe. I don't even know if it was real. But in my mind, it was a hand. A pale blur that reached down and grabbed the waistband of my trunks, yanking them hard to one side. I felt the fabric rip, a deep, tearing sound muffled by the water. Suddenly, I was free. I didn't swim to the surface so much as float. My arms moved weakly, but I think it was more instinct than anything. My body rose on its own, pulled upward like a balloon. I burst into the air with a gasp, coughing and choking and clawing at the bank until I could drag myself out. I collapsed on the grass, face down, shaking. Water poured out my nose and mouth. My chest heaved. I couldn't see straight. Everything was spinning. I don't know how long I lay there. Minutes, probably. Maybe more. When I finally sat up, I checked my trunks. One leg was shredded down the side, the tear jagged and frayed. I touched the edge of it with my fingers and stared at it like it was a wound. There was no one around. No footprints, no wet marks on the rocks. Just me, the rope, and the slow-moving stream. I didn't tell my parents. I don't know why. Maybe I was embarrassed. Maybe I didn't want to admit how stupid I'd been. But I never went back to that swimming hole alone. Not once. After that, I stayed close to the house. If I swam, it was in the shallow spots, the clear spots, the safe ones. Years later, I thought about what happened with more clarity. I've read enough about drowning to know what it does to the brain. The hallucinations, the way the mind invents saviors in the last seconds before losing consciousness.